The blue light of a smartphone screen flickers in a dark living room, illuminating a scene that defies human logic. In the center of the frame, a young woman offers a wide, chillingly genuine smile to the front-facing camera. Just inches behind her, the body of her father-in-law lies slumped, his life extinguished by more than 30 knife wounds. Most people use Instagram to capture fleeting moments of joy, but Amanda Taylor used it to archive an execution. This wasn't an act of desperation. It was a debut. Within seconds, the post button was pressed, launching a digital bloodbath that the world couldn't look away from. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. The story of Amanda Taylor, born Amanda Kimmer in 1991, did not begin in a vacuum of sudden violence. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of the human spirit that took place in the quiet, humid corners of Virginia. To those who lived near the Kimmer household, she appeared to be an average girl, perhaps a bit withdrawn, but nothing that signaled a future headline. Yet beneath the surface of that teenage normalcy, a predatory curiosity was taking root. By her early teens, Amanda was already drifting away from the interests of her peers, trading school dances and sports for the cold, unyielding glow of a computer monitor. She spent her nights descending into the most sequestered layers of the internet, the darknet forums, where the line between morbid curiosity and pathological worship is non-existent. Her psychiatric history began to accumulate like a grim ledger during these formative years. Doctors would later sift through records of bipolar disorder and severe clinical depression, trying to map the erratic peaks and valleys of her psyche. She described a persistent sense of detachment from the world around her, a feeling that reality was merely a backdrop for a more significant, darker stage. While other girls her age were pinning posters of pop stars to their walls, Amanda was cultivating an altar of a different kind. She became deeply entrenched in the aesthetic of the Columbine High School massacre, finding a strange, distorted kinship in the journals of Harris and Klebold. To her, their act of nihilistic destruction wasn't a tragedy to be mourned. It was a blueprint for a life that mattered. This wasn't a passing phase of teenage rebellion. Amanda's obsession with the greats of the criminal world became her primary social outlet. She didn't just want to read about serial killers, she wanted to touch them. She began a prolific correspondence with some of the most reviled men in the American prison system. She wrote letters to Joseph Condro, a convicted child killer, and Eric Freen, the sniper who led police on a weeks-long manhunt through the Pennsylvania woods. In the scratch of their ink on cheap prison stationery, Amanda found the validation she craved. She told her few real-world acquaintances that these monsters were the only ones who truly understood her. The smell of old paper and the sterile, metallic scent of the computer room became the sensory boundaries of her world. She was obsessed with the idea of infamy, of a name that would echo through history long after her physical form was gone. She once remarked to a friend that being a nobody was a fate worse than death. This drive for recognition was a hollow hunger that no ordinary life could satisfy. Her personality was a mosaic of borrowed traits from the killers she admired. The cold stare, the lack of empathy, the calculated use of shock to gain power over others. She began to view herself as an actress in a long-form drama that had not yet reached its climax. She was waiting for a catalyst, a person or an event that would bridge the gap between her digital fantasies and the physical world. By the time she reached her late teens, the desensitization was complete. She had spent thousands of hours consuming gore videos and reading autopsy reports, stripping away any natural revulsion to the sight of human suffering. She viewed the human body not as a vessel for a soul, but as a collection of biological components that could be dismantled. This clinical, detached perspective would eventually become her most dangerous weapon. She was a woman who lived in a state of perpetual low tension, a quiet before a storm that she was actively brewing in the basement of her own mind. She just needed a partner who was as broken as she was, someone to help her translate her internal darkness into a legacy of blood. The catalyst for the physical manifestation of Amanda's darkness arrived in the form of a man who was just as fractured as she was. Rex Taylor was not merely a romantic interest, he was a mirror. When they met in the late 2000s, Rex was already a man grappling with the heavy architecture of his own mind. Diagnosed with bipolar disorder and wrestling with a burgeoning dependency on substances that promised a temporary escape from his reality. To Amanda, he was the perfect co-author for the story she was writing. Their connection wasn't built on the traditional foundations of shared goals or quiet stability. It was forged in a mutual fascination with the fringe. They bonded over the macabre, spending their early dates discussing the very killers Amanda had been writing to in prison. In Rex, she found a man who didn't recoil from her altar of death. He helped her build it. In 2011, they formalized their union, a wedding that to outside observers looked like a chance for both to finally steady themselves. They settled into a modest life in the New River Valley area of Virginia, a region characterized by its rolling blue hills and the sharp, industrial lines of the Appalachian landscape. No domestic dream was a thin veil over a rotting structure. Within the first year of their marriage, the arrival of their first child, a son, offered a brief window of traditional joy. For a moment, the sensory details of life changed. The sterile smell of the computer room was replaced by the soft scent of baby powder and the rhythmic creak of a rocking chair. But for Amanda, motherhood wasn't a transformative experience. It was a cage. She described a profound sense of suffocation, a feeling that her identity as a warrior of the darknet was being erased by the mundane demands of diapers and feeding schedules. As the years progressed, the chemistry of their household became increasingly volatile. By 2013, they had a second child, a daughter, but the expanding family only served to heighten the tension. The air in their Christiansburg home became heavy with the scent of burnt foil and the acrid smoke of low-grade heroin. As the prescription pill mills in the Appalachian corridor began to tighten their grip, Rex and Amanda transitioned into harder, more desperate means of maintaining their equilibrium. Their relationship transformed into a suicide pact in slow motion. They would spend hours in the basement, a space they had decorated with dark, occult symbols and printed out photos of crime scenes, a DIY gallery of human misery. Amanda would read aloud from the trial transcripts of the shooters she admired, her voice a low, hypnotic drone. She was grooming Rex, attempting to overwrite his natural gentleness with the cold nihilism she had cultivated for over a decade. Central to the mounting friction in the Taylor household was Rex's father, Charles Taylor Sr. To the community of Montgomery County, Charles was a hardworking man, a mechanic who knew the value of a day's labor and the importance of family. He watched the descent of his son with a mixture of heartbreak and growing resolve. Charles became the primary financial and emotional support for the grandchildren, stepping in where the parents had checked out. He provided the groceries that Amanda and Rex couldn't afford. He paid the bills that went ignored while they chased their next high. But in Amanda's distorted worldview, Charles wasn't a savior, he was an interloper. She began to cultivate a toxic narrative, convinced that Charles was the poison in Rex's life. She blamed the father for the son's failures, weaving a complex web of resentment that grew more tangled with every pill they swallowed. Charles would often arrive unannounced, his heavy boots thudding on the porch, a sound that Amanda grew to loathe. He would bring bags of milk and bread, his eyes scanning the disarray of the living room with a weary, judgmental sigh. He didn't hide his disdain for Amanda's influence on his son. He saw her not as a wife, but as a parasite that was feeding on Rex's mental illness. The phone calls between them were short and spiked with venom. Charles would plead with Rex to go to rehab, to think of the children, while Amanda stood in the background, whispering into her husband's ear that his father was trying to control him, that he was trying to steal his soul. This tug of war over Rex's sanity became the defining feature of their daily lives. By late 2014, the marriage had finally shattered. Amanda moved out, leaving the children largely in the care of Rex and, by extension, Charles. This separation didn't bring her peace. It only intensified her focus on the man she believed had stolen her king. She spent her nights alone in a small apartment, the silence of the room amplifying the voices in her head, the voices of the serial killers who told her that greatness required a sacrifice. She watched from a distance as Rex spiraled, his father desperately trying to hold the fragments of his son's life together. To Amanda, every act of kindness Charles performed was a slap in the face, a reminder that she had failed as a wife and a mother. The sensory anchors of this period were grim. The metallic taste of cheap beer, and the sharp, chemical tang of crushed tablets on a glass coffee table. Amanda adopted a stark, gothic look, black hair, heavy eyeliner, and a wardrobe of dark, oversized clothing that hid the sharp angles of her frame. She wanted to look like a character from the forums she frequented. Rex, increasingly lost in a fog of depression and chemical dependency, became a shell of a man, a ghost white figure who trailed behind Amanda like a shadow. They were no longer a family, they were a cult of two. And as the financial walls closed in and the threat of losing custody of their children became a looming reality, Amanda's focus shifted away from survival. She was looking for a grand finale, a moment of cinematic violence that would immortalize their names. The resentment was no longer a simmering heat, it was a flashpoint. She began to describe Charles in her journals as a demon, a figure that needed to be purged. She was no longer just a spectator of violence, she was preparing to become its architect. The fragile equilibrium of the Taylor family finally snapped on a sweltering afternoon in August 2014. Rex Taylor, a man who had spent years wandering through the labyrinth of his own chemical and mental dependencies, reached a point where the light at the end of the tunnel simply vanished. He was found in his father's shed, the air thick with the smell of stagnant grease and old timber, suspended by a length of rope. His death was ruled a suicide, the tragic yet almost expected conclusion to a life lived on the edge of a precipice. But for Amanda, the snap of that rope wasn't just the end of a husband, it was the birth of a mission. She didn't see a man who had succumbed to his own darkness, she saw a victim of a calculated conspiracy. In the weeks following the funeral, the grief in Amanda's mind began to ferment into a high-proof rage. The funeral itself was a study in unspoken tension. She stood at the gravesite, a stark, obsidian figure against the green Virginia hillside, refusing to shed a tear, while her father-in-law, Charles Taylor Sr., wept openly. To Amanda, those tears were an insult. She watched him through narrowed eyes, convinced that his displays of sorrow were merely a performance to mask his guilt. She began to tell anyone who would listen, and many who wouldn't, that Charles was the one who had tightened the noose. In her twisted logic, his attempts to regulate Rex's medication, his insistence on sobriety, and his control over the family's finances were not acts of love, but weapons of psychological warfare that had driven Rex to his grave. The sensory world Amanda inhabited during this period became increasingly narrow. She retreated into a digital fortress, spending her nights in a dimly lit room where the only warmth came from the cooling fans of her laptop. She documented her descent on social media, her posts transitioning from mournful tributes to Rex to venomous screeds against the demon who had stolen him. She claimed that Charles had bullied Rex into suicide to gain full custody of the grandchildren. The sound of her own typing, the rapid, rhythmic clicking of keys, became the soundtrack of her radicalization. She wasn't just grieving, she was preparing. She began to view the upcoming anniversary of Rex's death not as a day of remembrance, but as a deadline for justice. The conflict over the children became the ultimate accelerant. Charles, fearing for the safety of his grandchildren given Amanda's increasingly erratic and drug-fueled behavior, sought and obtained a protective order. He was effectively the gatekeeper to her own blood, a role that confirmed her darkest suspicions. Every time she was denied access to her kids, she added another tally to the ledger she was keeping against Charles. She described the feeling of being locked out of her life as a physical weight, a cold, crushing pressure in her chest that only blood could alleviate. She wasn't looking for a legal solution. She was looking for a sacrifice that would satisfy the king she had lost. By early 2015, Amanda had found a new companion to fill the void Rex had left, a man named Sean Ball. Sean was not the intellectual or spiritual equal Amanda sought, but he was a willing tool. He was a man who drifted into her orbit at a time when her charisma was at its most predatory. She didn't offer him love, she offered him a place in a legend. She spoke to him in the same low, hypnotic tones she had once used on Rex, convincing him that their purpose was to avenge a fallen warrior. She painted a picture of Charles as an obstacle to their happiness, a monster that needed to be dispatched so they could finally be free. The plan wasn't born of a single moment of madness. It was a slow, meticulous assembly of hatred, fueled by the anniversary of Rex's suicide that loomed like a dark cloud over the spring of 2015. She told Sean that the only way to truly honor Rex was to give him the one thing he couldn't take for himself, his father's life. April 4th, 2015. A Saturday morning in Montgomery County, Virginia, where the air was beginning to carry the heavy, sweet scent of damp earth and early spring mountain laurel. For most of the residents in the small community of Ironto, it was a day for chores or quiet rest. But for Amanda Taylor, it was the day she had scheduled for her transformation. She woke up in a state of clinical clarity, a chilling lack of anxiety that she would later describe as the most peaceful she had felt since Rex's death. The morning was gray, the sun struggling to pierce the thick Appalachian fog that clung to the hollows like a shroud. She dressed with a specific utilitarian focus, dark clothes that wouldn't show the stains, the uniform of the warrior she believed herself to be. Sean Ball was with her, a silent shadow in the passenger seat of her car as they navigated the winding, gravel-strewn backroads toward Den Hill Road. The vehicle's tires crunched over the loose stone, a rhythmic, abrasive sound that punctuated the silence between them. Amanda didn't need to fill the air with words. Her intent was already a physical presence in the cramped cabin. She had brought a bayonet-style knife, a long, serrated piece of steel that felt cold and heavy against her thigh. She later told investigators that she felt the weapon was an extension of her own arm, a tool designed to finally cut away the poison that had ruined her life. They arrived at the modest home of Charles Taylor Sr. shortly before noon. The house was tucked away, surrounded by trees that had not yet fully regained their leaves, a skeletal landscape that offered little cover but felt isolated from the rest of the world. Charles was home, likely expecting a quiet weekend. He was a man of routine. The smell of stale coffee and sawdust usually defined his environment. When the knock came, he had no reason to suspect that death was standing on his porch, wearing the face of his daughter-in-law. The transition from entry to violence was near instantaneous. Amanda didn't hesitate at the threshold. She moved into the house with a predatory grace, Sean Ball trailing behind her like a reluctant apprentice. There was no long-form argument, no final plea for understanding. The air in the house was still, the only sound the low hum of a refrigerator and the soft thud of their boots on the floorboards. Then, the world shifted. The attack was a flurry of jagged, high-tension motion. Amanda drew the knife. Charles tried to move. Too slow. The first strike was a blunt, shocking intrusion into the silence. He staggered. She didn't stop. The blade was a silver blur in the dim light of the living room. She felt the resistance of fabric, the warmth of blood hitting her hands. It was slick, metallic. The smell of iron began to dominate the small space, thick and cloying. Charles fell to the floor, a heavy, final sound that vibrated through the floorboards. Amanda remained standing over him, her chest heaving, not with exhaustion, but with a surge of adrenaline that she later described as a pure, white-hot high. She wasn't looking at her father-in-law as a human being anymore. He was a task completed. He was the demon, purged. Sean Ball, standing near the doorway, watched as Amanda continued the assault long after Charles had stopped moving. She inflicted over 60 wounds, a frenzied, obsessive level of overkill that spoke to the years of fermented resentment she had carried. Every strike was a message to the ghost of Rex. She was proving her loyalty in the most brutal language possible. The high tension evaporated, replaced by a lingering, cold-blooded curiosity. Amanda looked down at the carnage she had created, and she didn't feel the need to run. Not yet. She felt a profound sense of pride. This was her masterpiece. This was the moment that would bridge the gap between the darknet forums and the history books. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her iPhone. The screen's glow was a sharp, electronic contrast to the organic, messy reality of the crime scene. She positioned herself carefully. She wanted the lighting to be right. She offered a genuine, wide smile to the lens, the kind of look one might see in a holiday photograph. Behind her, the body of Charles Taylor Sr. was slumped against the wall, a grim, crimson backdrop for her debut. The shutter clicked. One image, the ultimate digital trophy. She didn't just take the photo for herself, she took it for the fans she knew were waiting in the shadows of the internet. She wanted them to see that she was real. She wanted them to know that she wasn't just another girl with a morbid hobby. She was a practitioner. After the photo, the mundane requirements of a getaway began to reassert themselves. Amanda and Sean moved through the house with a detached efficiency. They took Charles's wallet, the leather worn and smelling of oil. A final petty theft from a man who had spent his life trying to help them. They also took his car keys. Amanda described a strange sense of ownership over the space, now that its master was gone. She felt like she had finally inherited the power Charles had held over her. As they walked back out into the cool Virginia air, the sensory details returned. The wind was still whispering through the pines. A bird called out from a nearby branch. The world hadn't stopped for the horror that had just occurred inside. Amanda felt a sense of disappointment that there wasn't a grander sign, a shift in the atmosphere to acknowledge her greatness. But she had the photo. She had the proof. They climbed into the car and pulled away from Den Hill Road, leaving the silent house behind. The drive back toward the main highway was a low-tension transition. Amanda began to scroll through her phone, her fingers still stained with a faint, copper-smelling residue, moving over the glass screen with practiced ease. She wasn't looking for a lawyer. She wasn't searching for a place to hide. She was looking for the right caption. She logged into her social media accounts and prepared the post. She wrote about how today was a good day. She wrote about how she had finally avenged her king. She hit post and watched as the data packets carried her crime across the globe, turning a private tragedy into a public spectacle. The adrenaline was fading now, replaced by a cold, calculating hunger for the reaction. She told Sean that they were famous now. She said that the police would be looking for them, but it didn't matter, because they had already won. The road ahead was long, and the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long skeletal shadows across the pavement. Amanda leaned back in her seat, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips as she waited for the world to notice her. The tires of the stolen car hummed a steady, hypnotic rhythm against the interstate asphalt as Amanda Taylor and Sean Ball crossed the state line, leaving the jagged peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains behind. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was a volatile mix of chemical high and the claustrophobic stench of unwashed bodies and dried copper. Amanda sat in the driver's seat, her posture rigid, her eyes darting between the road and the flickering screen of her smartphone. She wasn't looking at a GPS map to find a safe house. She was refreshing her notifications. Every like, every share, and every horrified comment on her recent post acted as a fresh dose of adrenaline. She told Sean that the world was finally waking up to who she really was, that the digital void was screaming back at her, and it sounded like worship. The sensory details of the getaway were stripped of any romanticized outlaw aesthetic. There was the crinkle of fast food wrappers on the floorboards, the bitter taste of cold coffee, and the constant, rhythmic vibration of a car pushed 10 miles over the speed limit. Amanda's focus was entirely external, directed at the thousands of strangers who were now witnessing her crime in real time. She began to treat the manhunt as a spectator sport, posting updates that taunted the authorities and teased her fans with the promise of more. She informed her followers that she was on a mission, that the blood on her hands was just the beginning of a larger, more significant purge. To her, the police cruisers that were undoubtedly beginning to mobilize across 2 states were merely extras in the high-stakes movie she was directing. As they moved deeper into the rural stretches of North Carolina, the dynamic between the 2 fugitives began to sour. Sean Ball was not the nihilistic warrior Amanda had envisioned. The high of the initial act had evaporated for him, replaced by the crushing weight of reality and the searing pain of the injuries he had sustained during the struggle with Charles. He was a man coming down from a fever dream, and the sight of Amanda, smiling at her phone, laughing at the chaos she had unleashed, began to provoke a primitive sense of terror. He told her he was hurting, his voice a low, tremulous rasp that grated against her nerves. Amanda looked at him, not with sympathy, but with the cold, calculating eye of an editor deciding which scenes to cut. She began to realize that Sean was a loose end. In her mind, the narrative of the lone, vengeful widow was much cleaner, much more iconic then a story involving a bumbling accomplice who was now whimpering in the passenger seat. She told him to be quiet, that he was ruining the mood. She began to frame him in her mind as another obstacle, another figure that failed to live up to the standard Rex had set. The air in the car grew heavy with a new kind of tension, one that was quiet, sharp, and focused. The low tension of the long drive was being replaced by the high tension of an impending betrayal. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the highway. And Amanda decided it was time for the second act. She pulled the car onto a desolate shoulder near a hospital in Asheville, the gravel crunching beneath the tires like breaking bone. The area was quiet, the sterile white light of the medical facility visible in the distance, a mocking symbol of the help Sean desperately needed. Amanda turned to him, the glow of the dashboard lights carving deep, hollow shadows into her face. She didn't offer a goodbye. She didn't offer an explanation. The movement was short, clipped, and brutally efficient. She drew the knife again. Sean barely had time to register the shift in her posture. The interior of the car became a frantic enclosed space of jagged motion. She struck him repeatedly, aiming for the torso, the neck, any part of him that would ensure he couldn't follow her. He struggled, his hands clawing at the upholstery, the sound of his ragged breathing filling the cabin. He managed to pull himself out of the car, collapsing onto the rough pavement. Amanda watched him for a moment, her expression one of mild annoyance, as if she were watching a broken piece of equipment. She told him he was lucky she was leaving him near a hospital. And then she put the car in gear. She drove away, watching in the rearview mirror as the small, crumpled shape of Sean Ball grew smaller against the gray asphalt. She was alone now. She felt a profound sense of cleansing. She picked up her phone and informed her digital audience that she had been forced to discard a traitor. She spoke of her journey as a solitary pilgrimage, a path that only the strongest could walk. She was heading toward a final confrontation, her mind already mapping out the next post, the next photo, the next way to ensure that the name Amanda Taylor would be etched into the digital consciousness forever. The vibration of the car felt smoother now, the silence of the cabin a perfect canvas for the voices in her head that told her she was finally free. The discovery of Charles Taylor Sr. was not a result of old-school detective intuition. It was a direct consequence of a social media notification. When the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office finally breached the heavy silence of the house on Den Hill Road, the sensory assault was immediate. The metallic, cloying scent of blood had permeated the small rooms, a thick, invisible fog that clung to the deputies' wool uniforms. They found Charles in a state that left no room for medical intervention, a human being reduced to a series of jagged statistics by a serrated bayonet. But even as the forensic teams began their grim, methodical choreography, the real investigation was already unfolding in the digital ether. Amanda Taylor hadn't just committed a murder, she had published a live-action manifesto. Investigators didn't have to hunt for a motive. It was pinned to the top of her public profile. Every post, every photograph, and every erratic update served as a digital breadcrumb trail that led directly to her. They watched as she taunted them from behind the safety of a glass screen, her words a volatile mixture of narcissistic triumph and drug-fueled delusion. The social echo was deafening. In the dark, damp corners of the internet where Amanda had spent her formative years, a disturbing transformation was taking place. She wasn't just a suspect. To a fringe group of online fans, she was becoming a dark icon. They analyzed her selfie with the cold detachment of art critics, debating the lighting and the authenticity of her smile. This was the new face of American crime, a performance that required an audience to be truly complete. In Montgomery County, the fear was not of the unknown, but of the familiar. Neighbors who had once waved to Charles on his porch now looked at their own phones with a newfound sense of dread, wondering what other monsters were hiding in plain sight behind filtered photos and status updates. The local atmosphere shifted from rural trust to a guarded digital paranoia. The manhunt spanned state lines, a high-stakes coordination between Virginia and North Carolina authorities. They utilized cell tower pings to track the stolen vehicle's erratic path, a digital tether that Amanda seemed to both embrace. She was a woman who simply couldn't stop talking to the world, even as the world was rapidly closing in on her. The tension in the command center was a palpable, low-tension hum of radio static and the frantic clicking of keyboards, the same sounds that had defined her life. The climax arrived on a desolate stretch of North Carolina highway. The blue and red strobes of the State Patrol reflected off the wet asphalt like neon paint. The high-tension moment was a blur of shouting and the sharp metallic snap of handcuffs. Amanda didn't go out in the cinematic blaze of glory she had envisioned. She was found in a state of total chemical exhaustion, her eyes hollow, her skin sallow under the harsh, white beams of the police cruisers. As she was led away, she didn't look like the warrior she claimed to be. She looked like a lost soul who had finally run out of room to run. The silence that followed her arrest was profound, a sudden, jarring end to a broadcast that had captivated the darkest parts of the human psyche. The courtroom in Montgomery County became the final sterile stage for Amanda Taylor's performance. Throughout the proceedings, she maintained the same chillingly detached demeanor that had defined her digital presence, smirking at the gallery and showing a total lack of remorse for the carnage she had orchestrated. She informed the court that she felt no guilt for the death of her father-in-law, framing the brutal execution as a necessary tribute to the memory of her husband. The sensory details of the trial were stark. The heavy, oppressive silence of the chamber and the sharp clinical descriptions provided by the medical examiners. In 2016, the jury reached a swift conclusion, finding her guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to life in prison, a verdict she received with a mocking, triumphant smile. Even behind bars, her obsession with infamy persisted. She continued to write letters to her followers, boasting of her crimes and ensuring her name remained a dark fixture in the true crime community. Amanda Taylor didn't just want to kill, she wanted to be witnessed. In the cold, infinite corridors of the web, her performance remains a jagged scar, a reminder of a psyche that valued the post over the pulse. She sought a throne in the shadows, but found only the sterile, four-walled silence of her cage. The pixels have faded, but the echo of that Saturday morning never will. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. In a quiet Springfield home, the family's favorite Gatorade didn't just provide hydration, it delivered a methodical, agonizing death. Diane Stout wasn't a stereotypical monster. She was a church organist, a nurse, and a mother who viewed her husband and children as administrative burdens to be deleted. With the clinical precision of her profession and the silence of a prayer, she began pruning her family tree, one antifreeze-laced drink at a time, until only the useful ones remained. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Springfield, Missouri, often called the Queen City of the Ozarks, carries a specific brand of Midwestern stillness, a place where the rhythms of life are dictated by the change of seasons and the steady tolling of church bells. In the early 2000s, the house on North Golden Avenue appeared to be just another unremarkable node in this social fabric. It was a modest, single-story residence, shaded by mature trees that cast long, skeletal shadows across a lawn that was rarely perfectly manicured. To the neighbors, the Stouts were a large, perhaps slightly eccentric family, but they were anchored by the presence of a woman who seemed to be the very definition of reliability. Diane Stout was 51 years old, a woman whose life was a masterclass in efficiency and community service. She was a registered nurse, a profession that demanded a high degree of clinical detachment and a stomach for the macabre realities of the human body. When she wasn't at the hospital, she was often found seated at the massive organ of the Redeemer Lutheran Church. There, her hands moved with practiced precision across the keys, filling the sanctuary with hymns that spoke of salvation and divine order. To those in the pews, Diane was the backbone of the congregation, sturdy, quiet, and deeply committed to the structure of her faith and her family. She was the primary breadwinner, the one who navigated the complexities of insurance, bills, and the daily logistics of a six-person household. However, inside the walls of the North Golden Avenue home, the air was thick with a different kind of tension, a heavy, stagnant frustration that Diane found increasingly difficult to breathe. Her husband, Mark Stout, was in many ways her polar opposite. Mark was a local fixture in the Springfield music scene, the lead singer and guitarist for a band called The Freaks. He was a man of charisma and creative energy, often seen with a guitar strapped to his back and a laid-back attitude that bordered on the terminal. While Diane spent her days in the sterile, high-stakes environment of a hospital, Mark spent much of his time in the basement or at local dives, chasing the fading echoes of a musical career that never quite hit the big time. To the outside world, he was the cool dad, the guy who brought a bit of rock and roll flair to the suburbs. To Diane, he was a drain, a man who contributed little to the family's financial stability and whose laziness felt like a personal insult to her own tireless work ethic. The children only added to the perceived weight on Diane's shoulders. Sean, the eldest at 26, was a quiet, introverted young man who lived at home. He struggled with a range of social and developmental issues, often withdrawing into his own world. Sarah, 24, was equally difficult in Diane's estimation. She was frequently unemployed, struggling to find her footing in adulthood, and her presence in the house felt like a permanent fixture that Diane hadn't authorized. Then there was Rachel, the 22-year-old who seemed to be the only one Diane could tolerate, perhaps because Rachel shared her mother's musical talent and a certain icy, observant nature. Brianna, the youngest, was still trying to navigate the chaotic energy of a home where the parents were increasingly becoming strangers to one another. As the months rolled into 2012, Diane's internal monologue began to shift. The resentment wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow-growing mold, silent and invasive. She looked at Mark and saw a man she no longer respected. She looked at Sean and Sarah and saw problems that would never be solved, only managed at her expense. In her mind, she wasn't just a mother and a wife. She was an administrator of a failing enterprise. The house felt cluttered, not just with physical objects, but with the annoyances of human needs that she was tired of meeting. The financial pressure of being the sole reliable earner, combined with the emotional exhaustion of managing 3 adult children who seemed to have no exit strategy, pushed Diane toward a terrifyingly pragmatic conclusion. She didn't want a divorce. That was messy, expensive, and socially embarrassing for a woman of her standing in the church. She didn't want to simply walk away. That would leave her with nothing. Instead, she began to view her family through the same clinical lens she used at the hospital. If a limb was gangrenous, you removed it to save the body. If a person was a burden, they were an inefficiency to be corrected. The hum of the refrigerator, the sound of Mark's guitar from the basement, and the constant, demanding presence of her children became a cacophony she decided to silence. She began to spend more time on the family computer, her nursing background guiding her toward substances that were common, easy to obtain, and, most importantly, difficult to detect in a routine autopsy. She wasn't looking for a weapon of passion. She was looking for a tool, something that could be administered slowly, mirroring the natural decline of a body, so that when the end came, it would look like a tragedy rather than a crime. The Queen City remained still, unaware that its most reliable organist was beginning to compose a final, lethal requiem for the people she was supposed to love most. The atmosphere inside the Stauder residence wasn't merely one of domestic friction. It was an ecosystem of silent, escalating contempt. In this house of 6, an invisible line had been drawn, bifurcating the family into 2 distinct camps, the Burdens and the Planners. At the center of this chilling division was the bond between Diane and her second youngest daughter, Rachel. While the other children were seen as failures or complications, Rachel was the protege. She was the one who shared her mother's aptitude for music and, more importantly, her mother's terrifyingly detached worldview. Together, they formed a coalition of 2 against a world they deemed beneath them, and eventually against the very people who shared their DNA. Diane's resentment for her husband, Mark, had long since curdled into a cold, administrative hatred. To her, Mark wasn't just a failing musician or a lazy partner. He was a faulty component in her life's machinery. She viewed his presence in the basement, surrounded by the cluttered remains of his musical ambitions, as a personal affront to her own orderly existence. The sound of his guitar, once perhaps a source of attraction, now served as a constant, rhythmic reminder of his perceived uselessness. She felt that she was subsidizing a life that contributed nothing back to the ledger. In her eyes, Mark was a consumer of resources, food, space, attention, without any measurable return on investment. This wasn't the fiery anger of a betrayed spouse. It was the calculated disdain of an auditor looking at a line item that needed to be erased. The annoyances did not stop with Mark. Diane's eldest son, Sean, was 26 and lived in a state of quiet social withdrawal that Diane found increasingly intolerable. She viewed his developmental struggles and his need for stability not with maternal compassion, but with the frustration of a woman forced to care for a broken tool. To Diane, Sean was a problem that refused to resolve itself. Then there was Sarah, the daughter Diane described as the epitome of laziness. Sarah's inability to maintain employment and her general lack of direction were, in Diane's estimation, a drain on the family's potential. Diane didn't see children in need of guidance. She saw a collection of things that were cluttering her path to a simplified, quiet life. It was within this shared headspace of elitist frustration that the bond with Rachel deepened. They were the intelligent ones, the talented ones. They would sit together, often in the kitchen or during long drives to church events, and discuss the state of the household with the clinical coldness of two generals discussing a failed battalion. Rachel didn't just listen to her mother's grievances, she validated them. She mirrored Diane's disgust, reinforcing the idea that the rest of the family was holding them back. This reinforcement was the catalyst that turned Diane's dark thoughts into a concrete objective. The why was simple. The house was too noisy, the bills were too high, and the people were too much. The how would become a shared project, a dark bonding exercise between mother and daughter. The transition from complaining about the family to planning their elimination happened in the quietest of increments. There were no shouting matches, only whispers over tea and secretive searches on the family computer. They began to research methods of medical correction that wouldn't draw the attention of the authorities. Diane's nursing background was the skeleton key that unlocked the plan. She knew the limits of standard toxicology screens and the symptoms of common illnesses. They needed something that could be integrated into the family's daily routines, something that looked like a natural, if tragic, decline. They eventually settled on ethylene glycol, antifreeze. It was cheap, easy to find in any hardware store or garage, and possessed a sickly sweet taste that could be easily masked by the sugary beverages the family favored. But it wasn't just about the poison, it was about the protocol. Diane and Rachel treated the upcoming murders like a household chore list. They discussed the order of operations, who would go first, and how the survivors would react to maintain the illusion of a grieving family. They decided that Mark would be the primary target. The head of the Burdens would be the first to fall. This period of the Stout household was perhaps the most haunting. To the neighbors and the church congregation, nothing had changed. Diane still played the organ, her notes soaring through the rafters of the Redeemer Lutheran Church, while Rachel stood by her side. But back on North Golden Avenue, the planners were beginning to prepare the first doses. They watched Mark from the shadows of the hallway, observing his habits, waiting for the right moment to slip the first drop of medical mystery into his drink. There was a sickening sense of superiority in their silence, a feeling that they were the masters of fate, and the rest of the family were merely players in a play that was reaching its final act. The resentment had been codified into a plan, and the annoyances were about to be addressed, one by one, with the icy pragmatism that had become the Stout family's true hidden legacy. The medical mystery that began to unfold inside the house on North Golden Avenue was not a mystery at all. It was a controlled experiment in human endurance. It started in the early spring of 2012, just as the Missouri landscape was beginning to thaw. The weapon of choice was deceptively simple: ethylene glycol, a common automotive coolant found in every garage in Springfield. It was clear, odorless, and carried a syrupy sweetness that blended perfectly into the high-fructose world of American soft drinks. For Diane Stott, the transition from nurse to executioner was as smooth as the liquid she began to measure into her husband's favorite beverages. Mark Stout was the first to experience the flu that never seemed to end. In late March, the charismatic guitarist, the man who lived for the stage, found himself unable to even walk up the stairs from his basement sanctuary. It began with a persistent, nagging nausea that he initially dismissed as a stomach bug, or perhaps the result of a few too many late nights at the local bars. But this was different. It was a heavy, systemic sickness that seemed to settle in his very marrow. He described a feeling of profound lethargy, a fog that descended over his mind, making even the simplest chords on his guitar feel like a complex mathematical equation he could no longer solve. Diane, ever the dutiful nurse, was right there to provide care. She was the one who brought him his drinks, bottles of bright orange Gatorade and cans of soda, insisting that he stay hydrated. She watched with clinical detachment as he tilted his head back and swallowed the very substance that was systematically crystallizing in his kidneys. Ethylene glycol is a patient killer. Once ingested, the body metabolizes it into glycolic acid and then oxalic acid, which binds with calcium to form microscopic, needle-like crystals. These crystals act like internal shrapnel, shredding the delicate tissues of the renal system and the brain. By the first week of April, Mark was a shadow of himself. He was bedridden, suffering from intense chest pains and a shortness of breath that made every word a struggle. He told his wife he felt like he was drowning on dry land. On Easter Sunday, while the rest of Springfield was celebrating renewal and life, Mark Stout took his last agonizing breath. He died in his bed, surrounded by the family he was supposedly burdening. Because of Diane's reputation as a nurse and her calm, professional demeanor, the attending physicians and the coroner didn't suspect foul play. They saw a man in his 50s with a history of a somewhat rock and roll lifestyle and chalked it up to natural causes, a heart attack or a sudden systemic failure. Diane insisted on a quick cremation, effectively incinerating the primary evidence of her crime before the ashes had even cooled. The house was quieter after Mark was gone, but for Diane and Rachel, it wasn't quiet enough. The pruning had only just begun. The summer of 2012 passed in a strange, hollow peace, but as the humidity of the Missouri August began to peak, the focus shifted to 26-year-old Sean. Sean was the quiet one, the son who lived in the margins of the family dynamic. He didn't have the social circle Mark had, and he didn't have the voice to protest when he too began to feel the same flu that had taken his father. The symptoms mirrored Mark's with terrifying accuracy. First came the vomiting, violent, racking bouts that left Sean dehydrated and trembling on the bathroom floor. Then came the confusion. He would wander through the house in a daze, unable to remember what he had been doing or where he was going. Diane and Rachel watched him with a curiosity that bordered on the macabre. They reportedly discussed how much antifreeze it would take to finish the job this time, curious if a young man's body would resist the poison more than an older one's. They treated Sean's decline like a case study, documenting his seizures and his fading motor skills. In early September, Sean's body finally gave out. He was found dead in his room, his organs having essentially shut down after weeks of being bathed in toxin. Again, the grieving mother played her part to perfection. She spoke to the authorities with a weary, tragic grace, lamenting the genetic curse that seemed to be taking her family. Once again, there was no autopsy. Once again, the body was rushed to the crematorium. Within 6 months, Diane had effectively erased 2 people from her life, and she had done so without a single drop of blood being spilled on her carpets. But the arrogance of the successful criminal is a dangerous thing. In the spring of 2013, Diane turned her sights on her daughter, Sarah. Sarah was 24, and in Diane's mind, she was the ultimate annoyance. The one who refused to leave, the one who contributed nothing. The protocol remained the same. The Gatorade bottles appeared, the hydration was enforced, and soon Sarah was suffering from the familiar, agonizing symptoms. She complained of blinding headaches and a numbness in her limbs that made it impossible for her to stand. However, Sarah's body fought back in a way the men's hadn't. By May 2013, she was in critical condition, her heart rate plummeting and her kidneys failing. Diane, perhaps feeling invincible after 2 successful murders, made the mistake of taking Sarah to the hospital. She likely expected Sarah to die in the ICU, another natural tragedy to add to her collection. She didn't account for the fact that doctors in a modern emergency room are trained to look for patterns. And the pattern emerging from the Stoda family was beginning to look less like a tragedy and more like a massacre. While Sarah lay in a hospital bed, her life hanging by a thread, the air in the Stauda house grew cold. The planners had been too efficient. They had left behind a trail of medical mysteries that were about to collide with a very skeptical medical community. The Gatorade was gone, but the damage was done. And as Sarah's blood was sent to the lab for a comprehensive screening, the clock began to tick on the church organist's perfect pragmatic life. When Sarah Stott was wheeled into the emergency room at Cox South Hospital in May 2013, she was less a person and more a collapsing biological system. At 24 years old, her body was shutting down with a terrifying, inexplicable speed. Her heart rate had plummeted to 40 beats per minute, her blood pressure was cratering, and her kidneys, the vital filters of the human form, had essentially ceased to function. To the medical staff, it looked like a catastrophic case of multi-organ failure, but the underlying cause remained a ghost in the machinery. There was no trauma, no obvious infection, and no history of chronic illness that could explain why a young woman was hovering on the edge of the grave. Diane Stauda stood in the corner of the intensive care unit, watching the frantic activity of the doctors and nurses with a composure that many found unsettling. As a nurse herself, she spoke the language of the hospital. She moved through the sterile hallways with a professional ease, providing the medical team with a detailed, clinical history of Sarah's mysterious decline. She spoke about the nausea, the weakness, and the sudden onset of confusion, framing it as yet another chapter in a family history defined by tragedy. However, it was this very history, this genetic curse, that began to pull at the loose threads of Diane's carefully constructed narrative. The primary red flag wasn't found in a lab report. It was found in the social history of the patient. One of the attending physicians, struck by the gravity of Sarah's condition, began to look into the Stauda family's recent past. The discovery was staggering. Within the span of just over a year, Diane had lost her husband, Mark, and her eldest son, Sean. Both had died suddenly. Both had suffered from vague gastrointestinal and neurological symptoms. And both had been cremated before the ink on their death certificates was even dry. To find three members of the same household suffering from the same rare, lethal constellation of symptoms within 14 months defied every law of medical probability. The doctors began to communicate in hushed tones behind the heavy glass of the ICU monitoring station. They weren't looking at a freak genetic anomaly anymore. They were looking at a cluster. The suspicion of foul play shifted from a dark thought to a mandatory medical inquiry. They noted that Diane's behavior didn't quite match the reality of her daughter's condition. While Sarah's brain was swelling and her body was struggling for every breath, Diane remained calm, almost administrative in her grieving process. She seemed more interested in the logistics of the situation than the emotional weight of potentially losing a third family member in a year. The turning point came when the medical team decided to run a comprehensive toxicology screen, specifically looking for substances that are often missed in standard panels. They were looking for heavy metals, rare toxins, or environmental poisons. When the results finally came back from the lab, the medical mystery vanished, replaced by a cold, chemical reality. Sarah's blood was saturated with ethylene glycol. The levels were so high that it was clear this wasn't a single accidental ingestion, but a sustained, methodical poisoning. The needle-like crystals identified in her system were the physical manifestation of the antifreeze Diane had been slipping into her daughter's drinks. The discovery sent a shockwave through the hospital staff. They realized that Sarah wasn't just a patient. She was a victim of a crime currently in progress. The protocol changed instantly. No longer was Sarah just being treated, she was being protected. The medical team alerted the Springfield Police Department, reporting that they had a young woman in their care who had been poisoned with antifreeze, and that her mother, a woman with medical training, was the primary person providing her with food and drink. While the police began to assemble their team, the doctors had to maintain a delicate balance. They couldn't let Diane know they were onto her, fearing she might flee or, worse, attempt to finish the job before Sarah could speak. They watched Diane on the security monitors as she sat by Sarah's bed, perhaps wondering why her daughter was still fighting, why this particular pruning was taking so long. The hospital, once a place of healing for Diane's family, had become a surveillance trap. The red flags had all turned a deep, lethal crimson, and the investigation was no longer confined to the sterile rooms of the ICU. It was moving out into the streets of Springfield, toward the house on North Golden Avenue, and toward the digital footprints of a woman who thought she could treat human lives like clinical data points to be deleted. The Springfield Police Department is a place of functional, sterile edges, a building designed for the processing of human failure. When Detective Neil McComas sat down across from Diane Stott in June 2013, the air in the small interrogation room was thick with the scent of ozone and stale coffee. Diane sat with her hands folded, her posture reflecting the same composed, maternal authority she had projected from the organ bench at church. To an outside observer, she looked like a woman who had been brought in to help, not a suspect who had just been accused of a triple poisoning. But McComas, a veteran of the Ozark's darker corners, recognized the specific unyielding stillness of a person who believed they were the smartest person in the room. The investigation had moved with a sudden, jarring momentum. While Sarah fought for her life in the hospital, police had executed a search warrant on the North Golden Avenue home. They didn't find a dramatic murder scene. Instead, they found the mundane remnants of a suburban execution. In the kitchen, tucked away behind boxes of cereal and bags of flour, were the bright, neon-colored bottles of Gatorade. When tested, these seemingly innocent beverages revealed the same chemical signature found in Sarah's blood, a lethal concentration of ethylene glycol. But the most damning evidence was digital. On the family computer, detectives discovered a history of searches that read like a recipe for a quiet massacre. They found inquiries into untraceable poisons, antifreeze poisoning symptoms, and how to kill with ethylene glycol. In the interrogation room, McComas began with a slow, rhythmic approach. He didn't lead with accusations, he led with the tragedy. He spoke about the loss of Mark and the sudden death of Sean, watching Diane's face for the slightest tremor of genuine grief. There was none. She spoke about her husband and son with a detached, almost pitying tone, as if they were difficult patients she had finally been relieved of. When McComas finally laid the toxicology reports on the table, the physical proof that Sarah was being systematically poisoned, the mask of the grieving nurse didn't crack. It simply shifted into a new, more terrifying shape. She eventually began to talk, her voice low and steady, lacking any inflection of remorse. She told the investigators that her life had become a series of annoyances. She described Mark as a parasite, a man who spent his days in the basement with his guitar while she worked double shifts to keep the family afloat. He was a drain on her resources and her patience. She explained that she had decided to simplify things. When McComas pushed her on the deaths of her husband and son, she admitted to the poisonings with a terrifyingly administrative logic. She told them that Sean was difficult and that his needs were a constant weight on her shoulders. In her mind, she wasn't a murderer. She was a gardener pruning away the dead wood to allow the rest of the tree to survive. But the investigation took an even darker turn when the focus shifted to Rachel. While Diane was being questioned, other detectives were speaking to the 22-year-old daughter who had been her mother's constant companion. They found a notebook belonging to Rachel, a journal of projects that outlined the family's elimination. It became clear that Rachel wasn't just a bystander. She was an architect. She had assisted her mother in the research, helped select the poison, and even suggested the order in which her family members should die. During her own interrogation, Rachel's detachment mirrored her mother's. She told the detectives that they had a plan to eventually move to a smaller house and live a quiet life, free from the clutter of the others. She spoke about the poisoning of her siblings and father as if she were discussing a difficult school project that she was glad to have finished. The investigators were struck by the complete lack of empathy in the room, a vacuum of humanity where maternal love and sibling bonds should have been. The why was perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire case. It wasn't about a massive insurance payout, although the money from Mark's death certainly helped. It wasn't a crime of passion or a sudden snap. It was a purely pragmatic decision to remove human beings who Diane and Rachel felt were inconvenient. They had looked at their family members and seen only liabilities. The clinical precision with which they administered the antifreeze, watching their loved ones suffer for weeks before they finally succumbed, pointed to a level of sociopathy that Springfield had rarely seen. As the sun set over the Ozarks, Diane Stott was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of armed criminal action. Rachel was taken into custody shortly after. The house on North Golden Avenue was cordoned off with yellow tape, a silent monument to the family that had been pruned into oblivion. The community was left to grapple with the reality that the woman playing the hymns on Sunday morning had spent her Saturday nights measuring out poison in the kitchen. The investigation had stripped away the Midwestern veneer of the Stauda family, revealing a core of icy, calculated detachment that would haunt the city for years to come. The legal resolution for the Stauda case was as cold and efficient as the crimes themselves. To avoid the high-stakes gamble of a death penalty trial, Diane Staude chose to plead guilty in 2016 to the first-degree murders of Mark and Sean, as well as the targeted assault on Sarah. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a final permanent removal from the society she tried so desperately to curate into her own version of perfection. Rachel Stott followed suit, accepting a plea deal that required her to testify against her mother if the case had ever reached a jury. She received 2 life sentences, but with the possibility of parole after serving 42.5 years. A long, slow count toward a freedom her father and brother would never see. Sarah survived the antifreeze protocol, but the damage was irreversible. The needle-like crystals had done their work, leaving her with significant neurological deficits. In the end, the pruning was complete, and the gardener was finally discarded. The Stott case stands as a harrowing monument to the banality of evil, a narrative where the monsters sat in church pews and played the organ. Diane didn't kill for passion, she killed for convenience. This administrative approach to murder remains a terrifying outlier in criminal history. Ultimately, the Queen City was left with a grim realization. The deadliest poison wasn't the chemical in the Gatorade. It was the icy, calculated silence of a mother who looked at her family and saw only a list of chores to be deleted. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. The midday sun over Bali is a heavy, humid blanket, but at the entrance of the St. Regis, a different chill is taking hold. A taxi driver stands frozen, staring at a massive suitcase abandoned by a young American heiress. It is far too heavy for clothes. Then he sees it, a dark, viscous liquid weeping from the zipper, staining the pristine pavement. Inside is not a luxury souvenir, but the battered remains of a Chicago socialite, stuffed into the luggage by her own daughter. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. To understand the brutality of Room 317, one must first step back into the quiet, tree-lined streets of Oak Park, Illinois, a place where wealth is whispered, not shouted. This was the world of Sheila von Wiesemak, a woman whose life was a masterclass in intellectual and social climbing. She was a scholar, a former staffer for Ted Kennedy, and a fixture in Chicago's elite circles. A woman who had spent decades curating a life of absolute refinement. Her husband, James Mack, was the gravity that held their world together. A legendary composer, arranger, and conductor, James was a titan in the music industry, possessing a creative intellect that commanded respect in every room he entered. When their daughter, Heather, was born in 1995, she was the crown jewel of their affluent existence, the miracle child of a late-in-life marriage who wanted for nothing. The Mack residence on Linden Avenue was more than just a home. It was a fortress of privilege, filled with the sounds of classical music and the scent of old money. But the foundation of this golden life began to crumble in 2006. During a family vacation to Greece, James Mack, the family's protector and the primary source of Heather's adoration, passed away suddenly from a pulmonary embolism. At just 10 years old, Heather's world didn't just change, it shattered. For Sheila, the loss was a double-edged sword. She was now a grieving widow and the sole custodian of a daughter who was increasingly becoming a stranger. In the years that followed, the Linden Avenue house transformed from a sanctuary into a site of domestic warfare. The transition of Heather Mack from a privileged schoolgirl to a volatile adolescent was not a slow burn, but an explosion. By the time Heather entered her teenage years, the local police were no longer strangers to the Mack household. In fact, they were practically regulars. Between 2004 and 2014, records indicate that officers were called to the home a staggering 86 times. These weren't simple teenage tantrums or minor disagreements about curfews. The calls detailed a harrowing pattern of domestic terror. Sheila reported being punched, bitten, and pushed. In one particularly chilling incident, Heather was accused of breaking her mother's arm. On another occasion, she reportedly bit Sheila so hard it left a permanent mark. The violence was often triggered by the most mundane of restrictions, a refused request for money, a question about her whereabouts, or an attempt by Sheila to set a boundary. Behind the elegant facade of their social standing, Sheila was living in a state of perpetual fear. She told friends and responding officers that she was terrified of her own daughter, describing a girl who seemed to possess a cold, detached rage that Sheila could neither understand nor control. Despite the bruises and the broken bones, Sheila remained trapped in a cycle of maternal hope and enabling. She would call the police in a moment of crisis, only to decline pressing charges once the adrenaline faded. She was a woman trying to save a daughter who was already slipping into a dark, narcissistic abyss. As Heather grew older, the conflict shifted from physical outbursts to a more calculated financial desperation. Heather knew that upon her mother's death, she would stand to inherit a trust fund valued at over $1.5 million. This wasn't just pocket change. It was the key to a life of total autonomy, free from Sheila's fretful supervision. The dynamic in the house became a poisonous mix of Heather's entitlement and Sheila's desperate attempts to buy her daughter's love with luxury items and international travel. By 2013, the atmosphere was reaching a terminal velocity. Heather had begun to associate with a local high school dropout named Tommy Schaefer, a young man who shared her penchant for luxury but lacked the means to achieve it. To Sheila, Tommy wasn't just a bad influence, he was the catalyst for her daughter's final descent. She saw the two of them together as a toxic symbiosis, two people who viewed Sheila not as a person, but as an obstacle standing between them and $1 million payday. The local community watched from the sidelines, hearing the sirens and seeing the squad cars parked outside the Mack home with disturbing frequency. Rumors of the rot inside the mansion began to spread through the elite circles of Oak Park. People wondered how a woman as brilliant as Sheila could lose control so completely, but no one truly understood the depth of the darkness taking root. Heather Mack wasn't just a rebellious teen anymore. She was a young woman who had realized that her mother was worth far more to her dead than she ever was alive. The entry of Tommy Schaefer into Heather Mack's world wasn't a romance. It was a high-velocity collision. To the elite circles of Oak Park, Tommy was a ghost from a different reality. A high school dropout with a thin resume, a penchant for expensive streetwear, and a reputation for volatility that seemed to perfectly mirror Heather's own internal storm. He was an aspiring rapper who spent more time cultivating an image of success than achieving it. And in Heather, he found a woman who didn't just admire his rebellion, she was willing to fund it. Sheila Von Wiese Mack saw the change in her daughter immediately. The girl who had been drifting since her father's death was suddenly tethered to something far more dangerous. Sheila viewed Tommy not as a boyfriend, but as a catalyst for Heather's worst impulses. To her, he was the embodiment of everything she had tried to shield Heather from, a man who viewed the Mack legacy as a lottery ticket rather than a heritage. The relationship quickly settled into a toxic symbiosis. It was fueled by Sheila's money and a shared us-against-the-world delusion that cast Sheila as the villain in a melodrama of their own making. Heather would demand exorbitant amounts of cash for designer clothes, high-end dinners, and investments into Tommy's music career. When Sheila attempted to tighten the purse strings, the fortress on Linden Avenue became a literal combat zone. We have to look closely at those 86 police calls mentioned earlier, because they tell the story of a decade-long siege. The officers of the Oak Park Police Department grew to know the Mack residents better than their own precincts. They knew which floorboards creaked and exactly which room Sheila would be hiding in when the shouting started. These weren't just calls about noise or teenage rebellion. They were reports of a mother being trapped in her own home. Officers documented Sheila with bruises on her neck, scratches on her face, and a haunting, hollow look in her eyes that spoke of a woman who had realized her daughter was no longer a child, but a predator. In one of the most chilling documented incidents, Sheila reported that Heather had broken her arm during a struggle over a cell phone. The scholar, the woman who had worked in the highest levels of American politics, was being physically dismantled by her own flesh and blood. Yet the enabling continued. Sheila would call for help in the heat of the moment, but when the sirens faded and the paperwork was presented, she would refuse to press charges. She was caught in a maternal trap, believing that one more vacation, one more expensive gift, or one more gesture of reconciliation would finally bring her daughter back from the brink. By early 2014, the stakes reached a terminal velocity when Heather discovered she was pregnant. For a 19-year-old with no employment and a boyfriend who lived at home with his mother, this should have been a moment of profound crisis. Instead, for Heather and Tommy, the pregnancy was a tactical pivot. It was the ultimate leverage. Heather kept the news hidden from Sheila for weeks, whispering about it to Tommy in the dark of her bedroom while her mother sat alone downstairs. To the young couple, this unborn child wasn't a new life. It was a new reason to demand the $1.5 million trust fund that Sheila held behind a wall of legal requirements. The trust fund, established by James Mack, was intended to be Heather's safety net, but it had become her obsession. Sheila had made it clear that Heather would only receive the full amount if she demonstrated stability and a willingness to separate herself from Tommy's influence. To the couple, this wasn't parental guidance, it was financial kidnapping. Their private text messages from this period reveal a cold, clinical detachment. They referred to Sheila as a bitch and an obstacle. They began to fantasize about a world where the gatekeeper was gone, and the money was finally theirs to spend on a life of international luxury. The psychological rot was total. Tommy and Heather didn't just want the money, they felt they were being persecuted for wanting it. The pregnancy added a frantic, ticking clock element to their greed. They needed the resources before the baby arrived, and they were tired of waiting for Sheila to do the right thing and die. The tension inside the home was so thick, it was almost tactile. The smell of Tommy's cigarettes, which Sheila had forbidden, often wafted through the vents, a constant reminder to the mother that she had lost control of her own sanctuary. In a final, desperate attempt to save her daughter and perhaps her own life, Sheila proposed a trip to Bali in August 2014. She sold it as a reconciliation tour, a chance for the two of them to escape the toxicity of Chicago and find a way back to each other in the lap of luxury at the St. Regis. Sheila paid for everything: the first-class flights, the sprawling suite in Nusa Dua, the fine dining. She believed she was buying a second chance, but Heather was already steps ahead. Using her mother's stolen credit card data, Heather secretly purchased a $12,000 business class ticket for Tommy Schaefer, while Sheila was packing her elegant resort wear, thinking of sunsets and peace. Heather and Tommy were finalizing a different kind of itinerary. Tommy wasn't going to Bali to vacation. He was going there to finish what had started in Oak Park. The three of them were now on a collision course with a tropical paradise that would soon become a slaughterhouse. Sheila arrived in Bali first, enjoying a few days of deceptive calm with her daughter. They lounged by the pool and ate at world-class restaurants. Sheila even emailed friends back home, telling them that things seemed to be improving, that Heather was finally softening. She had no idea that Tommy was already in the air, crossing the Pacific with a heart full of resentment and a plan that would leave the silver suitcase at the St. Regis stained with a bloodline that had finally reached its breaking point. The St. Regis Bali Resort is a labyrinth of marble, manicured gardens, and absolute whispered discretion. It is a place designed to make the outside world disappear. A gilded cage where the staff is trained to anticipate a guest's every whim before they even speak. On the night of August 12th, 2014, the air in Nusa Dua was thick with the scent of tropical rain and blooming hibiscus. But inside Suite 317, the atmosphere was reaching a terminal, suffocating pressure. Sheila von Wiesemak sat in the room she had paid for with the intention of healing her family. unaware that her executioner was currently moving through the hotel's corridors, funded by her own stolen credit card. Tommy Schaefer had arrived in Bali like a shadow, a ghost in a designer sweatshirt who had no business being in a 5-star resort. He had checked in under a cloud of secrecy, his presence known only to Heather. For the first few hours, the couple played a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek, whispering in the dark while Sheila occupied the main area of the suite. But the deception couldn't hold. The truth exploded in the early hours of August 13th, when Sheila realized that Tommy hadn't just followed them to Indonesia. He was standing in her very sanctuary. The confrontation that followed was not a sudden burst of passion, but the violent conclusion of a decade of domestic rot. The walls of Suite 317 became a pressure cooker. Sheila reportedly confronted the pair about the secret pregnancy, the stolen funds, and the absolute betrayal of the reconciliation trip. She told them, with the clarity of a woman who had finally reached her limit, that the money was finished, that Tommy would never see a cent of the Mack estate, and that Heather's future was now shackled to a man who was nothing more than a common thief. In that narrow hallway between the elegant furniture and the pristine white linens, the tension finally snapped. Tommy didn't reach for a knife. He didn't have a gun. He reached for the nearest heavy object, a decorative metal fruit bowl. It was a piece of hotel luxury, a heavy, cold item meant to hold tropical fruit for the elite. And it was about to become an instrument of slaughter. The first blow was a sickening, hollow thud. Sheila didn't have the chance to scream. The metal struck her with the concentrated force of years of Tommy's resentment and Heather's greed. She fell against the bed, her white resort wear beginning to bloom with deep, crimson stains that the high-end laundry service would never be able to remove. Tommy did not stop at one blow. He struck her again and again, a frenzied, rhythmic assault. The autopsy would later reveal the sheer brutality of the attack. A fractured skull, a broken nose, and defensive wounds on her hands that proved Sheila had fought with everything she had left to ward off the man her daughter loved. During the struggle, the room was a blur of violence. Forensic evidence would later paint a chilling picture of Heather's involvement. While Tommy swung the metal bowl, some accounts suggest Heather was not merely a bystander. She was an anchor. There were indications that she helped pin her mother down, perhaps muffling her cries or ensuring she couldn't escape the hallway. The miracle child watched as the woman who had given her a life of unimaginable privilege was systematically dismantled. Then, the silence returned to room 317. The only sound was the hum of the expensive air conditioning and the heavy, ragged breathing of two killers. Sheila von Wiesemak, the scholar who had navigated the halls of power in Washington, lay dead on the floor of a vacation paradise. The obstacle had finally been removed, but the relief they expected didn't come. In its place was the cold, clinical pressure of the aftermath. The room was a slaughterhouse. Blood was sprayed across the marble and the white upholstery. Tommy looked down at his hands, which were sliced and bruised from the ferocity of the attack. They didn't call the police. They didn't scream for help. They began to work. They spent the next several hours in a state of gruesome pragmatism. They used hotel towels to mop up the blood, but it was useless. The volume was too great. They realized they couldn't stay in the room, and they couldn't leave the body behind. Their eyes fell on the massive silver suitcase that Sheila had brought to hold her designer wardrobe. It was the only vessel large enough for their needs. What followed was a scene of pure horror. The body was still warm, but the suitcase was not designed for a human occupant. They began the task of packing Sheila. It was a physical impossibility made real by the adrenaline of a looming death sentence. They broke her bones. They folded her limbs at unnatural angles. They pushed and shoved with a desperate, frantic energy. They were trying to fit a life into a piece of Samsonite. The silver casing began to bulge. The zipper groaned under the strain of the weight. They wrapped the suitcase in extra plastic and duct tape, trying to contain the liquid that was already beginning to seep through the seams. They were checking out of the St. Regis, but only 2 of them would be walking through the lobby. Sheila was now just cargo, a heavy, stained secret that they needed to disappear before the Bali sun rose over the horizon. Throughout the night, they moved with a detached, chilling efficiency. They cleaned themselves up, changing into fresh clothes as if they hadn't just spent the last 3 hours mangling a corpse. They whispered about their escape, about the life they would lead once they were back in the States with the trust fund finally in their grasp. They had convinced themselves that they were the victims, that Sheila had forced their hand, and that the silver suitcase was simply the final price of their freedom. As the first light of dawn began to touch the palm trees outside, the couple looked around the ruined suite one last time. They grabbed their bags, gripped the handle of the silver suitcase, and headed for the elevator. They moved through the halls where other guests were still sleeping, past the night staff who offered polite nods, and into the humid morning air. They were two young lovers on vacation, hauling their luggage toward a waiting taxi, carrying the battered remains of the woman who had paid for their front row seat to her own murder. The morning air at the St. Regis was already beginning to shimmer with a heavy, oppressive heat when the elevator doors slid open at approximately 6 a.m. There was no fanfare, no final goodbye to the luxury they had inhabited, only the rhythmic, metallic clicking of a suitcase's wheels against the polished marble floor. To any casual observer, the young couple looked like typical tourists making an early break for the airport. But the weight of their luggage told a different story. CCTV footage from the resort's lobby would later become a centerpiece of the global fascination with the case, capturing a chillingly mundane series of events. It showed the pair struggling with a massive silver suitcase, the kind designed for long-haul international travel, now seemingly overstuffed beyond its capacity. The movements were jerky, uncoordinated. The physics of the bag didn't make sense for a collection of resort wear and souvenirs. Every time the wheels hit a grout line in the stone, the entire frame of the suitcase shuddered. They approached a taxi driven by Iketut Kiana, a man who had spent years navigating the high-end tourist traffic of Nusa Dua. He later noted the sheer desperation in their haste. The young man, dressed in a white shirt and dark shorts, seemed frantic to get the silver suitcase into the trunk. When the driver moved to help, as was the standard of service at a 5-star establishment, he was struck by the impossible density of the cargo. It wasn't just heavy, it was solid, it was dead weight. As the trunk lid was slammed shut, the driver noticed a dark, viscous stain beginning to spread across the light-colored fabric of the suitcase's exterior. It was a deep, brownish-red liquid, seeping through the teeth of the zipper and dripping onto the pavement. The smell, even in the open air, was beginning to shift from the sweet scent of the resort's gardens to something metallic and cloying. Before the taxi could even pull away, the couple's narrative began to fracture. They told the driver they had forgotten their passports back in the room and instructed him to wait at the curb while they went back inside to retrieve them. It was a classic suitcase gambit, a way to distance themselves from the evidence without actually being seen abandoning it. They disappeared into the hotel's sprawling complex, moving not toward the elevators, but toward the service exits and the beach. Back in the taxi, the driver sat in the mounting heat. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The suspicion that had been a quiet hum in the back of his mind grew into a roar. He alerted the hotel's security team, who were already on high alert for a different reason. Housekeeping staff, entering Suite 317 to prepare it for the next guest, had found a scene that defied the resort's sanitized reputation. There was blood on the walls, blood soaked into the white linens, and towels that had been used in a futile attempt to scrub away a slaughter. The resort's security didn't wait. They called the local police, and within the hour, the St. Regis was swarming with officers. The focus immediately turned to the silver suitcase sitting in the trunk of the idling taxi. When the police finally unzipped the luggage, the reality of what had transpired in the early hours of the morning was laid bare. The suitcase didn't just contain the remains of a woman, it contained a gruesome puzzle of human anatomy. The victim had been folded into a shape no living person could maintain. Her limbs forced into a fetal position that had caused her bones to snap and her joints to dislocate. The sheer force required to compress a 62-year-old woman into that space was a testament to the adrenaline and the cold-blooded resolve of her killers. While forensic teams began the grim task of processing the body, the manhunt for the suitcase killers moved into the chaotic, neon-lit streets of Kuta, a world away from the refined silence of Nusa Dua. The couple had shed their high-end personas and were now moving like cornered animals through the low-rent motels and surf shops. They were caught in a paradox. They had the freedom they had killed for, but they had nowhere to go. Their faces were already being broadcast on every news screen in Indonesia. The search ended at the Risata Bali Resort, a significantly more modest hotel near the airport. It wasn't a sophisticated hideout. They had checked in under false names, but their American accents and their visible state of distress made them stand out like flares in the night. When the police moved in, they didn't find a defiant couple. They found two teenagers who seemed to have finally realized that the world they had tried to build on a foundation of blood was collapsing. They were found in a dimly lit room, reportedly sleeping or staring at the walls in a state of shock. There was no struggle during the arrest. The pair was handcuffed and led through a gauntlet of flashbulbs and shouting reporters. As they were pushed into the back of a police van, the image of the heiress in handcuffs became the defining visual of the case. The search was over, but the investigation into the how and why was only just beginning, as the authorities began to peel back the layers of a conspiracy that had started in the quiet suburbs of Chicago and ended in a silver suitcase on the other side of the planet. The local community in Bali was left reeling. In a culture where the dead are treated with profound ritual and respect, the idea of a daughter stuffing her mother into a piece of luggage was a spiritual affront that many couldn't comprehend. The fear wasn't of the criminals themselves, who were now safely behind bars, but of the sheer, hollow void of empathy that the crime represented. The investigation would soon move from the physical evidence of the suitcase to the digital evidence left behind, revealing that while the murder happened in an instant, the plan had been months in the making. The interrogation rooms at Polda Bali are a far cry from the marble hallways of the St. Regis. They are small concrete boxes where the air is stagnant, and the only sound is the persistent low hum of a struggling air conditioner. It was here that the investigation into the death of Sheila von Wiesemak truly began, amidst the smell of strong coffee and the pungent, sweet aroma of clove cigarettes favored by the local detectives. Heather Mack and Tommy Schaefer sat in separate rooms, their faces illuminated by the harsh, flickering light of the precinct, as the reality of their situation began to settle like silt at the bottom of a river. The initial phase of the investigation was defined by a series of desperate, shifting narratives, the red herrings, that investigators had to painstakingly dismantle. Tommy was the first to spin a tale of terror. He told the Balinese officers that an armed gang had broken into Suite 317, claiming that he and Heather had been held at gunpoint and forced to witness a robbery gone wrong. He spoke of masked men and a violent struggle, attempting to cast himself and his girlfriend as victims of Indonesia's criminal underworld. It was a story designed to play on the fears of foreign tourists, but for the seasoned detectives in Denpasar, it lacked the weight of truth. There were no signs of forced entry, no other guests had reported a disturbance, and the CCTV footage told a much more damning story of two people calmly hauling a suitcase through a lobby. Heather's own version of events was equally fragmented. She initially maintained a wall of silence, her eyes darting around the room with a mixture of defiance and genuine terror. When she did speak, she attempted to distance herself from the physical act, portraying herself as a terrified daughter who had been trapped in the room while Tommy lost control. She described a scene of chaos and domestic explosion, but she couldn't explain why they hadn't called for help or why they had spent hours cleaning the suite and meticulously packing her mother into a piece of luggage. The breakthrough came not through a confession, but through the clinical, unyielding world of digital forensics. While the couple sat in their cells, Indonesian authorities collaborated with the FBI to gain access to the cell phones recovered from the scene. What they found was the smoking gun that transformed a heat-of-the-moment tragedy into a cold-blooded conspiracy. There were over 1,000 text messages exchanged between Heather and Tommy in the weeks leading up to the trip. These weren't the messages of two lovers. They were the blueprints of killers. The investigators read as Heather complained about her mother's control, referring to her as an obstacle that needed to be removed. They saw Tommy's responses, which were filled with a terrifying, hollow pragmatism. He asked about the trust fund. He asked about the best way to get it done. And he discussed the logistics of a murder as if he were planning a business merger. One particularly chilling message from Heather told Tommy that she was not joking about wanting her mother dead, that she was ready for the life that would follow. The digital trail revealed that Tommy's flight to Bali had been a deliberate move in a long-range plan, and that the reconciliation trip was nothing more than a trap. As the investigation solidified, the couple was moved to Karabokan Prison, locally known as Hotel K. It is a place of legend and nightmare, an overcrowded fortress where the scent of spicy food mingles with the stench of open sewers and the damp heat of the Indonesian rainy season. For Heather, the investigation took a deeply complex turn when it was confirmed that she was pregnant. The suitcase killer was about to become a mother in one of the most notorious prisons in the world. The birth of her daughter, Stella, in 2015 changed the optics of the case, but not the facts. Heather was allowed to keep the infant with her in the prison cell for the first 2 years, a common practice in Indonesia. The image of the young, white heiress navigating the cramped, dangerous world of Karabokan with a baby on her hip became a global sensation. To some, it was a story of redemption and maternal struggle. To the investigators, it was a tactical distraction. They watched as Heather seemingly adapted to prison life, reportedly rising in the internal social hierarchy of the women's wing, while her legal team fought a losing battle against the mounting evidence. Back in Chicago, the FBI was not content to let the Indonesian legal system have the final word. While the Bali court eventually sentenced Heather to 10 years and Tommy to 18 years for premeditated murder, American investigators were building their own case. They weren't looking at the murder itself, which fell under Indonesian jurisdiction, but at the conspiracy to commit murder against a U.S. citizen abroad. They continued to interview friends in Oak Park. They traced the money trail from Sheila's bank accounts. And they waited. The rumors inside Karabokan spoke of a woman who didn't just survive, but thrived. She was described as having a certain command over the other inmates, using what was left of her family's notoriety to carve out a position of relative comfort. Meanwhile, in the suburbs of Chicago, the social echo was one of profound betrayal. Former friends of Sheila von Wiesemak gathered in quiet living rooms, trying to reconcile the image of the bright academic woman they knew with the gruesome reality of her end. They spoke of the warning signs they had missed, the 911 calls they had ignored, and the terrifying reality that the girl they had seen at garden parties was capable of such a hollow, calculated act. The final stage of the international investigation was a game of patience. For 7 years, the US government monitored Heather's time in Karabokan, gathering every scrap of evidence that could be used once she stepped back onto American soil. When she was released early for good behavior in 2021, the transition was a masterclass in law enforcement coordination. As Heather was escorted onto a flight back to the United States, Stella in tow, the FBI was waiting at the gate in Chicago. The investigation that had started in a humid police precinct in Denpasar had come full circle, and the queen of the prison was about to find out that the American justice system had a very long memory. When the wheels of the commercial jet touched down at O'Hare in 2021, the illusion of freedom vanished before the cabin doors even opened. Federal agents moved with a practiced, silent efficiency, boarding the aircraft to intercept the suitcase killer before she could take a single breath of American air. The transition from the lawless, humid cells of Karabokan to the sterile, pressurized reality of a U.S. federal facility was a jarring, final shift in her world. The United States government had little interest in the time she had served for the murder itself. They were instead prosecuting the cold-blooded conspiracy that had been hatched in the quiet living rooms of Oak Park. For 3 years, the legal machinery ground forward until January 2024, when the gavel finally came down with the weight of a decade's worth of blood. A judge in Chicago looked past the polished defense, sentencing Heather Mack to 26 years in federal prison. The court declared that she had treated her mother's life like a simple commercial transaction, a hurdle between her and $1 million fantasy. She had spent a decade running, but in that courtroom, the price of the silver suitcase had finally come due. Sheila von Wiesemak didn't just lose her life. She lost the legacy she spent decades building for the daughter she once called a miracle. The $1.5 million trust she guarded so fiercely is gone, swallowed by legal fees and the sterile walls of a federal cell. Heather Mack finally has her independence. but it is the hollow, echoing autonomy of a prisoner. The silver suitcase remains a monument to a bloodline severed by greed, proving that in her quest for everything, she ended up with nothing. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. A frantic motorist in Titusville, Texas, slams on his brakes as his headlights catch a woman huddled in a ditch, zip-tied, duct-taped, and shivering in the dirt. This is Samantha Woolford, the beloved mommy vlogger, whose disappearance triggered a statewide manhunt. But as paramedics rush to her side, the first responders notice something disturbing. Her makeup is flawlessly smudge-free, and her bonds are just loose enough to slip. In the age of digital clout, Samantha wasn't a victim. She was a director filming her own series finale. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Titusville, Texas, is the kind of place where the horizon feels like a physical weight. A flat, sun-bleached landscape where the local economy was built on the sweat of oil fields and the steady, unhurried pace of generational tradition. In 2015, the digital revolution was beginning to seep into these rural cracks, bringing with it a new kind of social currency that the town's older residents couldn't quite grasp. To the people at the local diner, a camera was for weddings and birthdays. To Samantha Woolford, a camera was a lifeline and a weapon. Samantha didn't fit the quiet, dusty mold of Titusville. Even in her youth, those who knew her described a woman who didn't just walk into a room. She entered it, eyes always scanning for an audience. She possessed a relentless, almost frantic energy that local acquaintances often mistook for simple ambition. She was an aspiring actress in a town with no stage, a performer with no script, waiting for a medium that would finally allow her to be the center of her own universe. When the mommy vlogger era of YouTube exploded in the early 2000s, Samantha found her calling. By 2015, the platform was no longer just a place for cat videos. It was a goldmine. Family channels were the new reality TV, turning mundane chores and toddler tantrums into million-dollar empires. Samantha watched these digital celebrities from her living room, seeing women just like her, young, blonde, seemingly perfect, building cult-like followings by selling the aesthetic of motherhood. She didn't see the hard work behind the editing or the loss of privacy. She only saw the validation, the likes, the comments that treated strangers like deities. She began her channel with a feverish intensity. Her early videos were a study in constructed reality. Carefully staged kitchen shots with soft focus filters, toddlers dressed in coordinated outfits that were too clean for actual play, and a perpetual frozen smile that never quite reached her eyes. She leaned heavily into the devoted wife persona, portraying a life of domestic bliss that was increasingly at odds with the mounting bills and the suffocating boredom of her daily life. To Samantha, if it wasn't captured on a memory card, it didn't happen. If it wasn't liked, it wasn't real. This psychological craving, often referred to as main character syndrome, began to alienate her from the community. Neighbors started noticing that Samantha was never without her tripod. She would film herself spontaneously, playing with her kids in the park, only to reset the scene 5 or 6 times because the lighting wasn't right or her daughter didn't giggle on cue. The children became props, small, living accessories meant to boost her engagement metrics. Friends who came over for coffee found themselves edited out of her life, or worse, scripted into her videos as the supportive best friend in a narrative they hadn't agreed to join. The disconnect was growing. While her online persona was gaining a modest, albeit stagnant following, her actual life was fraying. The high-definition world she curated for her subscribers required a level of financial investment she didn't have. High-end strollers, designer home decor, and the constant travel required to keep her content fresh. Her husband, a man whose hands were calloused from actual labor, grew increasingly baffled by the woman who would spend 4 hours editing a 3-minute clip of her making a sandwich. But as 2015 progressed, Samantha's numbers hit a plateau. The mommy vlogger market was saturated, and her perfect life narrative was losing its edge. She needed something bigger, something dramatic, a plot twist that would force the world to look at her, not just as a creator, but as a survivor. she began to realize that tragedy is the ultimate engagement driver. And if life wouldn't give her a tragedy, she would have to write one herself. Jason Wolford was a man carved out of the very limestone and cedar that defined the Texas Hill Country. A quiet, stoic figure who found his purpose in the tangible. He was a contractor by trade, a man who understood that a foundation was either level or it wasn't, and there was no filter in the world that could fix a crooked wall. To Jason, a home was a sanctuary, a place where the dirt of the day was washed off and the outside world was kept at bay. He had married Samantha because her initial vibrance felt like a sunbeam in a life of gray industrial sites. He mistook her restless need for attention for a simple zest for life, never realizing that for Samantha, the real world was merely a rehearsal for the digital one. The early years of their marriage were, to Jason's memory, relatively grounded. They lived in a modest ranch-style house on the outskirts of Titusville, a place where the wind carried the scent of dry grass and diesel. But as Samantha's digital footprint expanded, the house began to undergo a strange, unsettling transformation. It wasn't a renovation for comfort. It was a renovation for optics. Jason would return from a 10-hour shift to find the living room furniture rearranged, not for better flow, but to catch the golden hour light that Samantha needed for her weekly vlogs. The warm, lived-in colors of their home were replaced by an aggressive palette of whites and beiges. A sterile, minimalist backdrop that looked breathtaking on a 5-inch screen, but felt cold and inhospitable to a man with muddy boots. Their children, Leo and Mia, were born into a world of constant surveillance. Before Leo could even walk, he was being positioned on soft-knit blankets under ring lights that mimicked the midday sun. Jason often recalled the birthday parties, events that should have been milestones of joy, turned into grueling production schedules. Samantha would bake a 3-tier cake, not for the children to eat, but for the reveal. The kids were instructed to look surprised and giggle as if on cue. If Leo cried because the flash was too bright, Samantha didn't offer a mother's comfort. She offered a director's frustration, insisting they go again until the footage was clean. Jason told his coworkers he felt like a stranger in his own house, a man living in a museum where nothing could be touched, nothing could be messy, and everything was for sale. The financial divide became a canyon. Jason saw the bank statements, the hundreds of dollars spent on outfit hauls, aesthetic props, and high-end lighting equipment, while the actual roof over their heads was beginning to leak. He told Samantha they were living beyond their means. She countered that these were business expenses, investments in a future where they wouldn't have to worry about money. She spoke of brand deals and sponsorships as if they were guaranteed, while their reality was a mounting pile of credit card debt and a husband who was working overtime just to keep the lights on. Lights that were increasingly used to film Samantha, telling her fans how perfect her life was. Samantha's obsession wasn't just about money. It was about the hunger. Every like was a drop of water to a woman dying of thirst in a desert of her own making. She began to resent Jason's silence. His refusal to perform for her camera was seen as a personal betrayal. She told her followers that her husband was a private man, a narrative that made him look like a mysterious, romantic figure, while in reality, he was simply a man who wanted to eat his dinner in peace without a lens hovering over his plate. The tension reached a breaking point in late 2014 when Samantha realized that the perfect family angle was failing. The audience was bored. The comments were thinning. The algorithm, that cruel and invisible god she worshipped, was moving on. The community in Titusville began to view the Wolford household with a mix of pity and derision. At local high school football games or grocery store aisles, people would see Samantha holding her phone at arm's length, narrating her life to a phantom audience while her children wandered aimlessly nearby. She spoke to the camera with a familiar, high-pitched intimacy, as if the thousands of strangers on the other side of the screen were her only true confidants. Jason's family, traditional and private, began to distance themselves. His mother told him she couldn't stand the way Samantha exploited the children for clout. Jason defended his wife out of a sense of duty, but the weariness in his eyes was becoming harder to mask. He told his friends he didn't recognize the woman he had married, that she had become a composite of filters and scripted lines. By mid-2015, Samantha was desperate. She began to experiment with vulnerability as a content strategy. She filmed herself crying in her car, telling her camera that she was overwhelmed and struggling, though she never specified with what. These videos saw a spike in views. People loved a tragedy. They loved to see the cracks in the porcelain. Samantha watched the metrics with the cold precision of a scientist. She realized that her happiness was worth pennies, but her suffering was worth gold. The psychological shift was subtle but permanent. She started looking for ways to heighten the drama. She would exaggerate small illnesses or manufacture close calls in traffic to keep her audience on the edge of their seats. But even that wasn't enough. The comments started asking for more. They wanted to know about the danger of living in a rural area. They wanted thrill. Samantha realized that the only thing more viral than a perfect life was a life in peril. She began to study other true crime cases, not out of empathy, but for research. She looked at how the media reacted to abductions, how the public's heart bled for a woman taken too soon. She saw the way the world stopped for a victim. Jason noticed her becoming increasingly secretive, her nose constantly buried in her phone, her brow furrowed in deep, quiet thought. He assumed she was finally feeling the weight of their debt. He told her he was proud of her for slowing down the vlogging. He didn't realize she wasn't slowing down. She was just moving into pre-production for the biggest show of her life. She was no longer interested in being a mother or a wife. She wanted to be a headline. The night of October 14th, 2015 began with the kind of calculated normalcy that only a seasoned performer can maintain. A domestic scene so mundane, it was practically a script for her next upload. Samantha sat at the dinner table, the glow of her smartphone illuminating a face that had become a mask of digital ambition. She was scrolling through her engagement analytics, her thumb moving with the mechanical precision of a clockwork toy, watching the flatline of her recent views. She told Jason she was heading out to the 24-hour supermarket, a late-night run for organic milk and supplies she claimed were essential for the children's school lunches. She was wearing her uniform, the high-waisted yoga pants and the oversized salt and pepper hoodie that her subscribers equated with relatable, exhausted motherhood. There was no goodbye that hinted at forever. Only the soft, heavy click of the front door and the receding whine of her SUV's engine as she pulled out of the gravel driveway, leaving the house in a silence that would soon be shattered. Samantha didn't drive toward the fluorescent hum of the grocery store. Instead, she steered the vehicle toward the dark, jagged edges of the county line, choosing a stretch of farm-to-market road 3 miles from the town limits. This was a place where the streetlights were a distant memory, and the only witnesses were the scrub brush and the scavenging coyotes. The air was thick with the scent of parched earth and old asphalt, a sensory backdrop she had scouted days in advance. Samantha didn't just stop the car, she positioned it. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a production design. She angled the SUV so it sat half on, half off the shoulder. The front tires turned sharply toward the ditch to imply a forced detour. She left the driver's side door swung wide, a gaping metal maw that signaled a sudden, violent interruption of a peaceful journey. Then came the prop management. She took her iPhone, the device that had served as her digital soul, and tossed it into the tall yellow grass at the edge of the road. She ensured the screen was cracked just enough to imply it had been dropped in a panic, but not enough to suggest it had been discarded by its owner. She reached for a pint of blackberries she'd bought earlier in the day, specifically for this moment. She crushed them in her palms and scattered the dark, pulpy fruit across the driver's seat and the gravel outside, the juice staining the earth like old, oxidized blood in the moonlight. To a passing motorist, it would look like a struggle. To Samantha, it was just the right color grade for a crime scene. She took a single, white sneaker, the left one, and placed it 20 feet from the car, as if it had been kicked off during a desperate attempt to flee. She was building a set, every detail a brushstroke in a masterpiece of manufactured trauma. The logistics of the next 48 hours required a level of commitment that most actors would find agonizing. Samantha didn't go to a hotel or a friend's house. That would leave a digital paper trail or a witness. Instead, she retreated to a prearranged blind spot, a derelict wood frame hunting cabin on a piece of overgrown family property that Jason hadn't visited in years. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of dry rot and mouse droppings, but to Samantha, it was her dressing room. She began the degradation phase of her performance. She used a coarse piece of twine to bind her own wrists, pulling the knots with a grim intensity until the blood flow throbbed, creating the deep, purple-red welts that would eventually be her proof. She didn't eat. She barely drank. She wanted the gaunt, hollow-eyed look of a woman who had seen the abyss. She spent hours in front of a cracked, silvering mirror, practicing the 1,000-yard stare, the vacant, traumatized gaze that she knew would haunt a thumbnail and stop a scroll. She took a jagged stone from the cabin floor and abraded her own skin, creating struggle marks on her forearms and neck. Each scrape was a tactical move, a physical investment in her future fame. She thought about the headlines. She imagined the missing posters. She could almost hear the frantic, tearful voiceovers she would eventually record for her survival story video. For Samantha, the pain wasn't real. It was just production cost. While Titusville descended into a frenzy of search parties and panicked rumors, Samantha sat in the dark, listening to the wind howl through the cabin's cracks. She was hungry, she was cold, and her skin burned from the self-inflicted wounds. But she felt more alive than she ever had in her white and beige living room. She was finally the lead. She was no longer just a mommy vlogger, struggling for an audience. She was the most important woman in Texas. She monitored her progress through a secondary burner phone, watching the local news reports and the Pray for Samantha hashtags explode across social media. The numbers were climbing. The world was finally watching. By the time Thursday morning bled into the horizon, Samantha was ready for the series finale. She drove her SUV, which she had hidden under a camouflaged tarp in the brush, to a prominent shoulder on Highway 35, the main artery into Titusville. She exited the vehicle, leaving it idling with the hazard lights blinking, a rhythmic orange SOS that could be seen for half a mile. She crawled into the ditch, her clothes torn in strategic, censorship-friendly places. Her hair matted with dirt she had meticulously applied with her own hands. She felt the bite of the heavy-duty zip ties she'd finally cinched around her ankles, tight enough to leave a permanent mark, but loose enough to be survivable. She lay there in the cold Texas mud, heart hammering against her ribs, listening for the sound of an approaching engine. She didn't feel like a criminal. She didn't feel like a liar. As the first pair of headlights rounded the curve, Samantha Woolford took a deep, shaky breath and closed her eyes, ready to give the performance of a lifetime. The director was satisfied. The stage was set. The sound of screeching tires echoed across the flatland. A man's voice, thick with panic, calling out to see if she was alive. Samantha didn't answer immediately. She waited for him to get closer, waited for the flashlight to hit her face, waited for the moment of maximum dramatic impact. When she finally opened her eyes and let out a scripted, guttural sob, she wasn't crying for her husband or her children. She was crying because she knew, for the first time in her life, she had finally gone viral. The pre-dawn light in Titusville usually brings the sound of rattling pickup trucks and the low hum of air conditioners. But on the morning of October 15th, the town woke up to a silence that felt heavy, an absence that Jason Woolford felt in his marrow. He had spent the night in the half-conscious state of a husband waiting for a car door that never closed. When the sun finally crested the flat Texas horizon and the children began to stir, asking for the breakfast their mother always meticulously plated for her, morning routine vlogs, Jason realized the milk run had become a nightmare. He called Samantha's phone 12 times, 12 identical transitions to a voicemail greeting that sounded like a relic from a different life. By 7 a.m., he was standing in the sheriff's office, his work boots still coated in the previous day's dust, telling the deputy that his wife, the woman with 10,000 followers, had vanished into the dark. The search began with the kind of frantic, uncoordinated energy that defines a small town in crisis. A local rancher was the first to spot the silver SUV abandoned on Farm to Market Road. He told investigators that the vehicle looked like a discarded shell. The hazard lights had long since drained the battery, leaving the car dead and cold in the morning mist. When Jason arrived at the scene, held back by the yellow tape that now cordoned off his family's transport, He saw the evidence Samantha had planted with such surgical precision. He saw the open door. He saw the single white sneaker lying in the dirt like a surrender flag. Most devastatingly, he saw the dark, pulpy stains on the gravel. To the untrained eyes of the volunteer searchers, it was blood, the violent end of a struggle they could only imagine in their worst fears. Within hours, the quiet stretch of road was swarmed. Titusville didn't just search, it mobilized. More than 200 volunteers arrived from 3 different counties, bringing horses, ATVs, and a palpable sense of communal dread. The local Baptist church became a staging ground, serving lukewarm coffee to men in camouflage who spent their day hacking through dense cedar breaks and scanning the muddy banks of stagnant creeks. They weren't just looking for a neighbor, they were looking for a predator. The rumor mill in Titusville began to churn out monsters. Stories of drifters seen at the local truck stop, whispers of a serial kidnapper moving north from the border, and the inevitable dark suspicion that always falls on the husband. The police treated Jason with the cold, professional skepticism reserved for the last person to see her alive. He was brought into an interrogation room that smelled of stale cigarettes and floor wax, where detectives asked him, repeatedly, if he and Samantha had been fighting. He told them about the debt, about the cameras, about the way his wife seemed to be living a life he wasn't invited to. He explained that she was a good mother, but a restless soul, a description that the investigators wrote down with deep, underlined heavy strokes. While Jason sat under the fluorescent hum of the station, the town was being draped in yellow. Ribbons were tied to every fence post, every mailbox, and every storefront along the main drag. The image of Samantha, the one from her most popular Spring Haul video, where she looked radiant and untouched by the world, was plastered on every window. But the search wasn't just happening on the ground, it was happening in the digital ether. This was the pivot Samantha had engineered. While she sat in her derelict cabin, the vlogging community was cannibalizing her disappearance. Fellow mommy vloggers from as far away as California and New York were posting emergency updates, using Samantha's name in their titles to capture the surging traffic. They spoke in hushed, somber tones about the dangers of being a public figure, essentially creating a recursive loop of content that kept her name at the top of the algorithm. Online armchair detectives began scouring her old videos for clues, interpreting a stray shadow or a tired sigh as a premonition of her abduction. They were looking for a villain, and they found one in Jason. They pointed to his lack of emotion in news clips, unaware that the man was simply a Texan raised to keep his grief behind his teeth. As the 48-hour mark passed, the Texas Department of Public Safety issued a statewide alert. The search expanded into the air. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras began sweeping the scrubland, their blades thumping like a heartbeat over the town. The fear in Titusville became a physical thing. Mothers kept their children inside. Doors that had been left unlocked for decades were suddenly bolted, and every dark-colored car seen on a back road was reported to the police as a suspect. The detectives, however, were hitting their first dead ends. The blood on the gravel hadn't been sent to the lab yet, but the lead investigator noticed a strange detail. There were no footprints leading away from the car other than Samantha's own, no scuff marks from heavy boots, no signs of a body being dragged. The red herrings were numerous. A local fisherman reported seeing a suspicious van near the river, leading to a 12-hour dive operation that recovered nothing but rusted tires and a sunken rowboat. A woman in a neighboring town claimed she saw Samantha in the back of a truck, triggering a high-speed pursuit that ended with a confused teenager being pulled over on his way to a job site. Every lead was a phantom, every tip a ghost. The frustration in the sheriff's department was mounting. They had a crime scene that looked too perfect, a staged tableau that felt like a movie set rather than a struggle. The atmosphere in Titusville shifted from hope to a grim, ritualistic mourning. The community held a candlelight vigil on the third night, a sea of flickering flames in the high school parking lot. They prayed for a miracle, unaware that the object of their prayers was currently watching them through a burner phone, measuring their tears in likes per minute. The search had become the biggest event in the history of the county, a multi-million-dollar production that was exactly what Samantha had always dreamed of. Except for one thing. The detectives were finally getting the pings from the cell towers, and the digital ghost Samantha thought she had buried was about to start screaming. The shift from a rescue mission to a criminal investigation began not with a grand revelation, but with the smell of the crime scene. While the town of Titusville was still draped in yellow ribbons, the lead forensic technician was kneeling in the dirt of Farm to Market Road, leaning in toward the dark, sticky stains on the gravel. He didn't find the copper-heavy scent of human plasma, the metallic, iron-rich odor that lingers in the Texas heat. Instead, he found something cloying and sweet. Laboratory analysis would later confirm what the investigator already suspected. The blood that had terrified a community was nothing more than a mixture of crushed blackberries and corn syrup, a concoction designed to look vivid under a camera flash, but one that lacked the biological reality of a struggle. This was the first thread in a tapestry of deception that began to unravel with terrifying speed. Detectives turned their focus to the digital footprint Samantha thought she had erased. While she had expertly discarded her primary smartphone, she had underestimated the relentless, invisible memory of the cellular towers that crisscross the Texas plains. Technicians found a ghost signal, a secondary burner phone that had been pinging off a tower near the derelict hunting cabin for the exact duration of her disappearance. This device hadn't been idle. It had been used to access Samantha's own social media accounts hundreds of times, showing that while she was supposedly fighting for her life in the hands of a kidnapper, she was actually refreshing her mentions and monitoring her own viral growth. The investigation then moved to the local hardware stores within a 50-mile radius. In a town as small as Titusville, strangers buying high-tensile zip ties and industrial-grade duct tape are noticed, but a local celebrity is remembered. Surveillance footage from a gas station 3 towns over, recorded 48 hours before the abduction, showed a woman matching Samantha's description perfectly. She wasn't acting like a victim, she was a consumer. The footage captured her calmly browsing the aisles, selecting the very restraints that would later be found binding her in the ditch. She even stopped to check her reflection in the glass of the cooler, adjusting her hair with the practiced ease of someone preparing for a photo shoot. When Samantha was found and brought to the Titusville Regional Hospital, the forensic nurses noticed further inconsistencies that didn't align with the narrative of a violent kidnapping. The struggle marks on her neck and arms were too clean. They lacked the jagged, irregular tearing characteristic of an external assailant. Instead, the abrasions were linear and repetitive, patterns consistent with self-inflicted wounds. Most damningly, there was the matter of her physical appearance. Despite 48 hours in a den of captors, her skin was remarkably hydrated, and the smudge-proof mascara she had boasted about in a previous Beauty Favorites vlog remained perfectly intact. She looked less like a survivor of a traumatic event and more like an actress waiting for her close-up in the final act of a prestige drama. The detectives decided to play along with her performance during the first official interview, allowing her to weave a tale of hooded men and unmarked vans. They watched as she leaned into the trauma, her voice dropping to a fragile whisper, her hands trembling with a rhythmic precision that felt rehearsed. She told them about the darkness, the fear, the way she thought of her children in her final moments. But when the lead investigator leaned forward and placed a printout of the cellular tower pings on the table, followed by a high-definition still of her buying zip ties, the mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated. The air in the interrogation room became stagnant as the silence stretched out. Samantha didn't cry for her family or ask for a lawyer. Her first question to the detectives, delivered in a voice that was suddenly cold and devoid of the victim inflection, was to ask how many views the news reports had generated. She wanted to know if the search had trended nationally. She seemed less concerned with the impending felony charges for filing a false police report and more focused on the retention rates of her tragedy. Further searches of the derelict cabin revealed a production kit, a bag containing the blackberry juice, spare zip ties, and a detailed notebook. In those pages, Samantha hadn't written a diary of fear. She had written a storyboard. She had mapped out the discovery of her car, the clues she would leave behind, and even drafted the scripts for the post-abduction vlogs she planned to film once she was safely home. She had calculated the emotional beats of the town's grief, like a producer calculating the ratings for a season finale. The red herrings that had exhausted the local search parties, the suspicious vans and the phantom drifters, were all part of a narrative she had seeded through anonymous tips she sent to the police using her burner phone. As the realization of her hoax began to leak out to the local deputies, the mood in the station shifted from sympathy to a quiet, vibrating fury. They realized that the thousands of man-hours spent combing the brush, the hundreds of thousands of dollars in emergency funds, and the genuine gut-wrenching terror of the town's parents had been nothing more than set dressing for a 19-year-old's vanity. The main character had finally gotten her audience. But the applause was about to be replaced by the heavy, metallic sound of a jail cell door. The transition from local saint to town pariah was instantaneous. Samantha Woolford, the woman Titusville had spent 3 days praying for, was formally charged with filing a false police report and a secondary count of tampering with evidence. The trial was a sterile, procedural affair that stripped her of the cinematic filters she had spent years perfecting. In the courtroom, she sat with a practiced, hollow gaze, but the gallery was no longer her audience. It was her jury. The prosecution highlighted the $500,000 in wasted emergency funds and the psychological trauma inflicted on a community that had genuinely feared a predator was in their midst. Samantha accepted a plea deal to avoid jail time, receiving 5 years of probation and a mandate to repay the costs of the search. But the real sentence was the digital exile. Jason, the quiet contractor who had endured her narcissism for a decade, finally broke his silence, filing for divorce and securing a restraining order to protect their children from further exploitation. The director was left alone in a world that had finally stopped watching. Samantha Woolford thought she was filming a masterpiece, but she only succeeded in burning her own life to ash. Today, she is a ghost in the town that once prayed for her, a cautionary tale for the digital age. Her children will grow up knowing their mother preferred a viral tragedy over their reality, while Jason lives in a house that finally feels like a home because the cameras are dark. In the end, Samantha got the fame she craved, but she's the only one left in the theater, watching a screen that's finally gone black. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. In the manicured quiet of Carlisle, Ohio, perfection isn't a choice. It's a social contract. Brooke Skylar Richardson was the gold standard, a vibrant cheerleader with a porcelain smile. But in July 2017, a whisper in a doctor's office shattered the suburban silence, leading detectives to scorched earth behind a luxury home. Beneath the family's prize flowers lay the charred remains of a newborn, the byproduct of a 9-month lie that no one, not even her own parents, ever saw coming. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Carlisle, Ohio operates on a specific frequency, a low humming expectation of normalcy that filters through every tree-lined street and every freshly painted fence. It is a town where reputations are built over decades and can be dismantled in a single afternoon. In 2017, the Richardson name was synonymous with success. Scott and Kim were the pillars of their community, the kind of parents who never missed a game and whose children were always the first to volunteer. Their daughter, Brooke Skylar, known simply as Skylar to those close to her, was the crown jewel of this suburban crown. At 18, she was the quintessential Ohio girl, blonde, athletic, and possessed of a smile that seemed to suggest she had never known a day of true hardship. The social hierarchy of a place like Carlisle is often anchored by the high school football stadium, a cathedral of Friday night lights where the town's collective identity is forged in the dirt and the cheering. Skylar Richardson was a permanent fixture on those sidelines. To the casual observer, she was the definition of having it all. A varsity cheerleader, a member of the track team, and a student who navigated the complexities of senior year with a grace that bordered on the unnatural. But perfection is rarely a natural state. It is a performance that requires constant maintenance and a terrifying amount of discipline. Beneath the surface of the Golden Girl was a psyche frayed by years of body dysmorphia and an eating disorder that dictated the rhythm of her life. Her world was measured in calories, in the gap between her thighs, and in the approving nods from a mother who was equally obsessed with the family's aesthetic. Kim Richardson was more than just a parent. She was the architect of Skylar's public image. The two of them shared a bond that was intensely close, but also claustrophobic. A relationship built on the mutual understanding that their value was inextricably linked to how they were perceived by the neighbors. Kim's own social standing in Carlisle was high, and she expected nothing less from her daughter. The pressure wasn't always vocal. It was in the way a second helping of dinner was silently judged, or the way a slightly tighter-fitting track uniform would elicit a subtle, worried glance. In the months leading up to the spring of 2017, Skylar's struggle with food had taken a new, more frantic turn. She had always been small, dangerously so at times, but her obsession with fitness had become a shield. She was known for her orthorexia, a pathological obsession with healthful eating. In her mind, being thin was synonymous with being good, being worthy, and most importantly, being safe. If she was always at the gym, if she was always talking about her clean diet, no one would look too closely at the changes in her body. The irony was thick. In a house where every meal was scrutinized and every pound was a talking point, the most significant physical transformation of Skylar's life was about to go completely unnoticed. Or perhaps, more accurately, it was something everyone, from her parents to her coaches, unconsciously chose not to see because it didn't fit the established narrative. Carlisle is the kind of town that rewards those who stay within the lines. The Richardsons lived in a sprawling, beautiful home on Eagle Ridge Drive, a place where the interior design was as curated as their social calendar. They were the perfect family, a label they wore like armor. But armor is heavy, and by the time Skylar entered the final months of her senior year, the weight of that perfection was beginning to crush her. She was 18, a girl standing on the precipice of adulthood, heading toward a prestigious future at Miami University. The social echo of the town was loud, a constant reminder that any deviation from the script would be noticed and dissected. As the humidity of the Ohio summer began to settle over the valley, the air in the Richardson house grew thick with an unspoken, vibrating tension. Skylar was becoming more withdrawn, her smiles more forced, her movements more deliberate. She was a girl who had been trained from birth to manage her image, to hide her flaws, and to present a flawless facade to the world. But the facade was cracking. Her track teammates noticed she was slower. Her fellow cheerleaders noticed she was shorter of breath. But in a community built on the polite ignoring of unpleasantness, no one asked the questions that needed to be asked. The stage was set for a tragedy that would force an entire town to look into the mirror and wonder, what else were they choosing not to see in their pursuit of the suburban ideal? This wasn't just about a girl and a secret. It was about the crushing, invisible weight of being exactly who everyone expected you to be, every single second of the day. The Golden Girl was becoming a stranger in her own home, a ghost moving through the hallways of a life she no longer recognized. In the quiet rooms of the Eagle Ridge house, the silence was louder than any scream. It was a silence that would eventually be broken by the sound of a shovel hitting the dirt in the middle of the night. The secret didn't begin with a whisper. It began with the clinical, rhythmic thumping of a heartbeat in a small, sterile examination room on April 26, 2017. Skylar had walked into the gynecologist's office, seeking a prescription for birth control pills, a pragmatic step for a girl planning her future at university. Instead, she was met with the cold, immovable reality of an ultrasound. Dr. William Andrew delivered the news with the gravity of a seasoned professional, informing the 18-year-old that she wasn't just pregnant. She was nearly 32 weeks along. The finish line was already in sight, and the Golden Girl of Carlisle was running out of track. Her reaction was a masterclass in the very dissociation that had defined her adolescence. There were no tears, no frantic phone calls to her mother, and certainly no reaching out to the father, a boy named Trey Johnson, with whom she had shared a brief, unremarkable summer fling. Instead, Skylar simply looked at the doctor and stated that she could not have this baby. It wasn't a question or an opening for a dialogue. It was a desperate attempt to delete a reality that threatened the architecture of her life. When she walked out of that clinic, she didn't just leave a medical record behind, she left the truth. The weeks that followed were a grueling marathon of deception. In the Richardson household, where every physical change was a topic of conversation, Skylar managed to perform a miraculous act of camouflage. She leaned into the narrative she had built for years, the girl who was obsessed with the gym, the girl who struggled with bloating due to her eating disorder, the girl who lived on a diet of clean proteins and green tea. She traded her form-fitting cheerleading outfits for oversized hoodies and baggy tracksuits, claiming she was bulking for her fitness goals. It was a lie that her family, perhaps blinded by their own need for her to be perfect, swallowed without question. The psychological weight of this silence was astronomical. A crushing, invisible atmosphere that she breathed in every morning when she checked her reflection in the mirror. She watched as her stomach hardened, as the movements of the life inside her became impossible to ignore. Yet, she continued to post photos on social media of her flat midriff, using angles and filters to maintain the illusion. She was a girl living in two parallel universes, one where she was the graduating senior preparing for prom, and another where a ticking clock was counting down to a moment she refused to name. May 5th, 2017, just 2 days before the end, marked the ultimate test of her facade. It was the night of the senior prom. Skylar stood before her mother in a tight, shimmering dress, a garment that should have announced her condition to the world. But she had become an expert in the art of the internalized pregnancy. She held her breath, she stood with a specific posture, and she let the high-stress environment of the perfect family event mask the physical toll of her 38-week term. She danced, she smiled for the cameras, and she posed with her current boyfriend, Brandon, a boy who looked the part of the handsome accessory, but had no inkling that he was standing next to a girl on the verge of a medical crisis. Even as the town of Carlisle celebrated its youth, Skylar was retreating further into a mental bunker. She told the investigators later that she had convinced herself the baby wasn't real, that it was just another symptom of her broken body. This wasn't just a secret, it was a total psychological fracture. She had no nursery, no baby clothes, and no plan. She didn't search for how to give birth on her phone. Instead, she searched for how to get a flat stomach fast. The denial was so profound that it bordered on the pathological. She was waiting for the problem to go away, even as the biological inevitability of labor began to shadow her every move. The social echo of her life, the texts from friends, the congratulations on her college acceptance, felt like they were coming from a distant planet. She moved through the hallways of Carlisle High School like a ghost, her secret tucked away beneath layers of cotton and a practiced, empty smile. Every time her mother complimented her on her weight loss or her dedication to the gym, it was like a fresh twist of a knife. The very traits that made her the perfect girl, her discipline, her ability to hide her pain, her obsession with appearance, were the very traits that were now fueling her descent into a nightmare. The silence wasn't just hers. It was a collective failure of a family and a community that prized the image over the individual. It was the silence of a mother who didn't notice the physical changes in a daughter she saw every day. It was the silence of a father who was too proud of his daughter's athletic prowess to see her suffering. And it was the silence of a girl who believed that being bad was a fate worse than death. As the first week of May drew to a close, the Ohio spring was in full bloom. But for Skylar Richardson, the world was about to turn cold, dark, and unimaginably quiet. She was an 18-year-old girl standing on the edge of a cliff, and the only thing she knew for certain was that she couldn't let anyone see her fall. The countdown was over. The 9-month silence was about to be broken by the only sound she had spent her entire life trying to suppress. The sound of a reality she couldn't control. The night of May 7th, 2017 didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a heavy, suffocating pause in the middle of a sentence. While the rest of Carlisle slept under a mild spring sky, the temperature hovering in the low 60s Fahrenheit, the second floor of the Richardson home on Eagle Ridge Drive became the stage for a silent, clinical horror. A space defined by white tile, expensive soaps, and a level of cleanliness that mirrored the family's public reputation. As the first sharp, localized waves of labor began to tear through her, Skylar didn't cry out. She couldn't. To scream would be to invite her parents, sleeping just rooms away, into a reality that would destroy everything they had built. She leaned against the cold porcelain of the bathtub, her fingers gripping the edge until her knuckles turned the color of the tiles. The sensory anchors of that night were stark. The hum of the air conditioning, the smell of lavender-scented candles, and the rhythmic, terrifying pressure radiating from her spine. In the darkness, the Golden Girl was performing her most grueling routine yet, a solitary birth. She told the investigators later that the pain was like nothing she had ever imagined, a physical dismantling that left her gasping for air in the humid bathroom. Every contraction was a countdown. She moved between the toilet and the floor, her movements frantic yet hushed, terrified that a single misplaced groan would bring her mother to the door. This wasn't a miracle of life. It was a desperate, messy, and silent extraction of a secret that had grown too large to contain. Somewhere in the early morning hours, the baby arrived, a girl. Skylar would later call her Annabelle, but in that moment, the child was an enigma. According to the story Skylar would eventually tell, the infant was purple, cold, and, most importantly, silent. There was no first cry to pierce the suburban quiet, no movement to signal a future. Whether this was the truth of a tragic stillbirth or a convenient narrative for a girl in a corner would become the central, bloody question of the next 2 years. But that night, in the dim light of the bathroom, the only thing that mattered was the weight of the tiny, limp body in her hands. The panic that followed was a cold, vibrating frequency. Skylar sat on the floor, the evidence of her crime stark against the white tile. She didn't call 911. She didn't wake her father. Instead, she began the process of erasing. She used towels to scrub the floor until it gleamed, a frantic effort to return the room to its state of pristine perfection. Then, she wrapped the infant in a towel and prepared for the final act. The walk from the back door to the edge of the property felt like a journey across a desert. The backyard was a sprawling manicured expanse, featuring a patio and a fire pit, the quintessential settings for the Richardson family's summer gatherings. But Skylar wasn't looking for a place to host a party. She moved toward the darkness beneath the trees, the damp Ohio soil clinging to her bare feet. She found a spot between two large trees, far enough from the house to be hidden, but close enough to be under the constant, silent watch of her bedroom window. Digging a grave with your bare hands and a small garden spade in the middle of the night is a sensory experience that leaves a permanent mark on the psyche. The smell of wet earth and decaying leaves, the sound of the metal blade hitting rocks and roots, the frantic, shallow breaths of an 18-year-old girl who believed her life was over. She dug until the hole was perhaps a foot deep. It wasn't a grave for a person, it was a hole for a secret. She placed the towel-wrapped bundle inside and covered it with the cold, dark dirt, tamping it down until the ground looked undisturbed. When she returned to the house, the silence was still there, but it was different now. It was the silence of a tomb. She climbed back into her bed, her body aching and her mind fractured. She checked her phone. It was nearly sunrise. She did what she had always done when things got difficult. She tried to pivot back to the Golden Girl persona. She texted her mother about her plans for the day. She posted a selfie about her workout routine, and she began the process of pretending that the night in the dark had never happened. But the backyard wasn't empty. Beneath the roots of the trees, the physical evidence of her 9-month lie was cooling in the Ohio earth. The contrast was almost too much to bear. Inside, a girl was washing the blood from her skin and preparing for a graduation ceremony. Outside, a shallow, unmarked grave was waiting to be found. The morning light of May 8th hit the Richardson house with a chilling normalcy. Scott and Kim woke up. The coffee was brewed, and the routine of perfection continued. Skylar moved through the next few days like a sleepwalker. She attended her graduation, she smiled for family photos, and she even went to the gym. To the neighbors, she was the same Skylar Richardson they had always known, perhaps a bit thinner, perhaps a bit more tired, but still the pride of Carlisle. They had no idea that every time she looked out of her window, her eyes were drawn to the patch of dirt between the trees. Every time the wind blew through the leaves, she heard the rustle of the secret she had buried. This night would become the focal point of a forensic war. The prosecution would later argue that she didn't just bury the baby. They would claim she tried to burn it, using the family fire pit to incinerate the evidence of her shame. They would point to charred bones and a girl who was too obsessed with her image to allow a child to live. The defense would counter with a story of a terrified teenager who gave birth to a stillborn baby and didn't know what else to do. But on the night of May 7th, there were no lawyers and no forensic experts. There was only a girl, a spade, and a dark, quiet backyard in a town that never wanted to know the truth. The night in the dark was the moment the perfect girl died, even if it took 2 more months for the world to notice. The secret wasn't just in the ground, it was in the way she walked, the way she didn't eat, and the way she stared at the tree line until her eyes burned. The architecture of perfection had held, but the foundation was made of dirt and bone, and the first cracks were already beginning to show. The heat of July in Ohio is a heavy, stagnant thing, a thick blanket of humidity that clings to the skin and slows the world to a crawl. On July 12, 2017, 2 months after the night in the dark, Brooke Skylar Richardson returned to the gynecologist's office. She wasn't there for a checkup or to discuss the life she had carried. She was there for a refill of her birth control pills. She walked into the clinic with the same composed porcelain doll exterior that had shielded her for months. But the medical staff had not forgotten the April ultrasound. Dr. William Andrew and his colleague, Dr. Casey, were met with a girl who looked significantly different. The physical weight of the pregnancy was gone, yet there was no mention of a child. When the doctors gently questioned her about the baby, the architecture of perfection finally suffered its first catastrophic collapse. The silence that had lasted 9 months dissolved into a few jagged, terrifying sentences. Skylar admitted that she had given birth alone in the middle of the night, that the baby was stillborn, and, most chillingly, that she had buried the remains in the backyard of her parents' home. Forensic reality. The doctors, bound by law and a sudden, visceral sense of alarm, contacted the Warren County Sheriff's Office. The secret was no longer in the ground, it was on the record. The investigation didn't begin with sirens and flashing lights. It began with a phone call to Lieutenant John Fain. Fain was a man used to the darker corners of human behavior, but the report coming out of Carlisle felt uniquely unsettling. He met Skylar at the police station later that day. The atmosphere of that first interview was a study in psychological tension. Skylar sat in the sterile room, her small frame dwarfed by the chair, still performing the role of the good girl. She told the lieutenant that the baby was born on May 7th, that it didn't breathe, and that she had acted out of a blind, paralyzing fear of her parents' reaction. She described the burial spot with an unnerving precision, pointing to the area between the 2 large trees near the fire pit. By the evening of July 14th, the Richardsons' perfect property on Eagle Ridge Drive was transformed into a theater of forensic archaeology. The sensory contrast was jarring: the vibrant green of the midsummer lawn, the colorful flower beds maintained by Kim Richardson, and the bright yellow crime scene tape that now bisected the yard. Neighbors watched from behind their curtains as men in white Tyvek suits moved through the heat, carrying shovels, sifting screens, and small hand tools. The social echo of the town began to vibrate with a new, ugly energy. The rumors traveled faster than the detectives could dig. Whispers of a hidden pregnancy, of a girl who had taken care of a problem to save her reputation. The excavation was a slow, agonizing process. Forensic teams from the coroner's office and anthropological experts treated the backyard like a historical site, aware that every inch of soil could hold a piece of the puzzle. The air was filled with the rhythmic sound of metal hitting dirt, a dull, repetitive thud that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Lieutenant Fain watched as the specialists knelt in the dirt, their movements deliberate and respectful. They weren't just looking for remains, they were looking for the truth of how that life had ended. At approximately 10:30 p.m., beneath the glare of portable floodlights that cast long, distorted shadows against the Richardson home, the first discovery was made. About 12 inches beneath the surface, in the very spot Skylar had described, the team uncovered the first small, fragile bones. The sight of a tiny human skull emerging from the dark Ohio soil was a moment that silenced everyone on the scene. It was a physical manifestation of a tragedy that had been denied for months. The The remains were meticulously removed, placed into evidence containers, and transported to the Montgomery County Coroner's Office for a more detailed examination. As the forensic team worked, the Richardsons, Scott and Kim, stood in a state of apparent frozen shock. The Golden Girl was inside with investigators, while her parents watched their backyard being dismantled. The realization that their daughter had carried a child to term, delivered it in their home, and buried it just feet from their back door while they slept, was a psychological blow that seemed to defy their understanding of reality. The image they had curated so carefully was not just cracked, it was being dug up and placed in evidence bags. The initial field report from the scene contained a detail that would change the trajectory of the case from a medical tragedy to a potential capital crime. One of the forensic experts noted that some of the bones appeared charred or blackened. This single observation, made in the flickering light of the backyard, suggested something far more sinister than a panicked burial. It suggested an attempt to incinerate the remains. It suggested malice. It suggested that Brooke Skylar Richardson hadn't just buried her secret, she had tried to destroy it with fire. That night, as the floodlights were finally packed away and the Eagle Ridge house returned to darkness, the town of Carlisle was no longer the same. The backyard secret was the only topic of conversation in the local diners and on social media. The girl on the sidelines, the one who had represented the very best of the community, was now being cast as a monster in the town's collective imagination. The July excavation had provided the remains, but it had also unearthed a well of public anger and suspicion that would only grow as the forensic war began. The perfect girl was gone, replaced by a defendant in a case that would force the world to look at the dark side of the suburban dream. The walls of an interrogation room have a way of absorbing the truth while radiating a specific kind of sterile, high-stakes pressure. Inside the Warren County Sheriff's Office, the air was conditioned to a crisp, uncomfortable chill, a stark contrast to the sweltering July heat outside. Brooke Skylar Richardson sat across from Lieutenant John Fain and Detective Brandy Carter, her small frame pulled tight, her eyes darting between the investigators. She was still trying to be the good girl, the polite student who followed instructions. But the detectives were no longer looking for a missing person. They were looking for a killer. The first interrogation was an exercise in careful navigation. Skylar spoke in a small, hollow voice, recounting the night in May with a detached precision that bordered on the clinical. She told them she was terrified, that she didn't know what to do, and that the baby had been born into a cold, silent world. She maintained that she never heard a cry, never felt a movement. It was a story of a medical tragedy handled by a teenager in shock. But the detectives were trained to look for the fissures in such narratives, and they were already armed with a preliminary forensic report that would change the temperature of the room. The forensic war began with a single, devastating error that would become the epicenter of the entire case. Dr. Elizabeth Murray, a respected forensic anthropologist, had performed an initial examination of the tiny remains found in the shallow grave. In the flickering light of her laboratory, she noted a dark, scorched appearance on several of the bones. She concluded and communicated to the investigators that the remains had been charred or burned. It was a bombshell that obliterated any chance of a sympathetic hearing for Skylar. In the eyes of the law, a burial was a panic. A burning was a desecration. It was the difference between a girl who was scared and a monster who was calculating. Equipped with this fact, the investigators brought Skylar back into the room for a second, much more aggressive interview on July 20th, 2017. The tone had shifted from inquiry to accusation. They told her they knew the truth. They told her the bones were burned. They pushed her hour after hour, using the psychological leverage of her own good girl persona against her. They suggested that perhaps she had tried to cremate the baby to get rid of the evidence. They pressured her to admit that the baby might have been alive, even for a moment. In a phenomenon often seen in high-pressure interrogations of young, vulnerable suspects, Skylar began to fold. Her need to please authority, her desire to fix the situation, led her into a psychological trap. When the detectives insisted the baby was burned, she eventually stopped fighting the narrative. She told them she might have used a lighter, that she might have seen a small flame. She even reached a point where she admitted the baby might have made a sound. These weren't statements of fact. They were concessions made by a girl whose mind had been dismantled by hours of guilt-tripping and leading questions. To the prosecution, it was a confession. To the defense, it was a tragedy of coercion. The leak of the burned baby narrative to the public was like pouring gasoline on a forest fire. The social echo of Carlisle and the surrounding Warren County turned toxic almost overnight. The headlines were sensational, painting a picture of a cheerleader who gave birth, killed her baby, and then tried to incinerate the remains in the family fire pit. The perfect girl was now the most hated person in Ohio. The community's reaction was visceral. People left dolls on the Richardsons' lawn, protesters gathered outside the courthouse, and the online discourse was a sewer of vitriol. The forensic error had poisoned the well of public opinion before a single juror was ever seated. As the case moved toward trial, a secondary forensic battle was brewing behind the scenes. The defense team, led by high-profile attorneys Charlie and Ritt Ritgers, had hired their own experts to review the remains. They brought in world-renowned specialists who looked at the bones and saw something entirely different. They realized that the charred appearance wasn't the result of fire at all. It was soil staining. The dark, organic material of the shallow grave had seeped into the fragile, porous bones over the 2 months they were buried, creating a discoloration that an eager eye could mistake for burning. When Dr. Murray eventually re-examined the remains and realized her initial assessment was wrong, she attempted to correct the record. She admitted that the bones were not burned, but by then, the burned baby narrative was a runaway train. The logical reality, the possibility of a stillbirth, and a social narrative of a golden girl who would do anything to keep her crown. The interrogations highlighted the terrifying power of the state to shape a teenager's memory, and the forensic error showed how easily science can be blinded by a desire for a definitive answer. Behind the sterile walls of the interrogation room, the truth hadn't just been buried, it had been distorted beyond recognition, leaving a fractured girl to face a jury that had already heard the worst possible version of her story. The sensory details of those hours in the station were etched into Skylar's memory. The smell of burnt coffee, the clicking of the detective's pens, and the heavy, accusing silence that followed every one of her denials. She was a girl who had never even had a speeding ticket, now facing the possibility of life in prison because of a confession that felt more like a surrender. The detectives had played on her biggest fear, that her parents would hate her, telling her that the only way to save her family was to tell them what they wanted to hear. It was a masterclass in psychological pressure, one that would leave a permanent scar on the case and ensure that, no matter the verdict, Skylar Richardson would never again be the perfect girl of Carlisle. The burned bone controversy became a cautionary tale for forensic science, a reminder of the catastrophic consequences of an initial, unverified field observation. But in 2017, it was the weapon the prosecution used to ensure Skylar wouldn't just be tried for a crime. She would be tried for being a monster. The momentum of the case was now unstoppable, fueled by a mixture of forensic error, a coerced confession, and a town's demand for justice for the tiny life buried beneath the trees. The courtroom in September 2019 was a pressure cooker of suburban judgment. 2 years after the July excavation, the Golden Girl stood before a jury, her porcelain facade replaced by the hollowed-out stare of a woman facing life in prison. The prosecution painted a portrait of a calculated killer, a girl who sacrificed her child on the altar of her own reputation. They focused on her 9-month lie and the clinical silence of the bathroom birth. The defense countered with a narrative of a medical tragedy, a stillborn girl named Annabelle, and a teenager dismantled by an eating disorder and the crushing expectation of perfection. When the verdict finally echoed through the hall, it was a split decision that satisfied no one. Skylar was acquitted of murder, manslaughter, and child endangerment, but found guilty of the gross abuse of a corpse. The judge sentenced her to 3 years of probation, a punishment that felt like a slap in the face to those who demanded blood, and a lifelong mark for the girl who just wanted to be perfect. The social echo of Carlisle has faded, but the silence on Eagle Ridge Drive remains heavy. Brooke Skylar Richardson remains a polarizing figure, a girl caught between a biological crisis and a suburban dream that left no room for error. Today, The patch of earth between the two trees is covered in thick grass. A quiet, unmarked end for the child she called Annabelle. It stands as a grim anchor for a town that learned, too late, that the most dangerous secrets aren't the ones we bury, but the ones we refuse to see. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.